Hello, everyone. I am the narrator and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw him, I nearly dropped my protein shake there. I stood in the gym's harsh fluorescent lighting, my reflection mirroring me perfectly in the wall-to-wall mirrors except when it didn't. For just a fraction of a second as I raised the bottle to my lips, my reflection continued its curl repetitions, biceps flexing while my own arm remained motionless. By the time I blinked, everything had synchronized again. My heart skipped several beats, leaving me elated. I convinced myself it was just the pre-workout supplement, kicking in, sleep deprivation, stress, anything but what my eyes had registered. I never used to be the paranoid type. My life was predictable tediously, so I worked in financial analysis, maintained a small circle of friends, and had a tidy apartment in a forgettable apartment complex. My routines were sacred, Monday through Friday at the office, evenings at the gym, weekends for errands and occasional social obligations. Nothing that would attract attention from anyone, let alone something otherworldly. But that was before I began to fragment, before I started losing pieces of myself to something wearing my face. The gym incident was just the beginning. 3 days later, I spotted a man who looked exactly like me across the parking lot outside my office building. He wore the same navy blue suit I had on, the same tortoiseshell glasses perched on my nose. When our eyes met, his lips curled into a knowing smile before he disappeared behind a column. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the autumn chill, I sprinted across the lot, lungs burning, only to find nothing but an empty loading dock. I began to notice the smell. First my cologne, but stronger, lingering in places I hadn't been, my bedroom closet wryer of it. One morning, though I'd applied none the previous day, the bathroom mirror fogged up while I slept, as if someone had taken a shower. Small rearrangements in my apartment followed: books on different shelves, the remote control on the wrong side of the coffee table, my toothbrush mysteriously wet when I reached for it. In the morning, my coworker Allison mentioned the interesting conversation we'd had about cryptocurrency at the water cooler yesterday. The blood drained from my face as I nodded absently, my throat constricting. I'd been in back-to-back meetings all day. Never once stopping at the water cooler, she must have noticed my expression because she quickly changed the subject. But the damage was done. Someone wearing my face was walking through my workplace, having conversations. I had no memory of panic attacks. Became my new normal. My chest would constrict without warning, breath coming in, shallow gas, heart hammering against my rib cage like it wanted to escape. I'd find myself hunched over, fingers digging into my thighs, struggling to distinguish reality from nightmare. The worst episodes came at night. I'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced someone was standing in the darkness of my bedroom watching me. With my own eyes, I installed cameras in my apartment, one in each room plus the front door. The first night brought nothing unusual. The second night at 2:17 a.m., the bedroom camera recorded me. Rising from bed, walking to the kitchen, and preparing a sandwich. I had no memory of making the footage. Showed me eating it while scrolling through my phone, then washing the dish and returning to bed. Except I'd slept through the night, or thought I had. The doppelganger was becoming bolder. My boss complimented me on the presentation I had supposedly given at the department meeting, a presentation I hadn't prepared or delivered. My neighbor thanked me for helping him move his couch, an event that never happened in my timeline. My mother called to discuss dinner plans we'd apparently made for the following weekend. Photographs provided the most damning evidence. A college friend posted pictures from a bar crawl. I had declined to attend there. I was, arm thrown around his shoulders, beer in hand, grinning widely. The timestamp confirmed it was from last Saturday night, when I'd been alone in my apartment watching documentaries. In the background of the image, partially obscured by revelers, stood another figure with my face watching the camera with cold, calculated eyes. My reflection grew increasingly autonomous. While brushing my teeth, it would sometimes pause to study me, toothbrush hovering near its mouth while mine continued to scrub at the gym. It would perform different exercises entirely. drawing curious glances from other members who clearly saw the discrepancy but were too polite or too disturbed to mention it. Once, as I changed shirts in a department store fitting room, my reflection reached toward the mirror separating us, fingertips pressing against the glass until I stumbled backward. Knocking over a display rack in my haste to escape sleep became impossible. Every noise in my apartment, the settling of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic transformed into footsteps, into breathing, into the soft, deliberate sounds of someone moving through my space. I developed a tic of constantly checking reflective surfaces, then avoiding them entirely, covering the bathroom mirror with a towel and angling my computer screen to prevent seeing my reflection. The exhaustion only made the paranoia worse, reality growing thin and permeable around me. I started documenting everything I kept, meticulous notes of my daily activities, time-stamped and photographed. I recorded voice memos throughout the day, leaving breadcrumbs for myself. In case the other me started taking over more completely, I began wearing a fitness tracker that recorded my heart rate steps and sleep patterns, checking it obsessively for anomalies. Periods of activity during times I believed I was sedentary. The data confirmed my worst fears. According to the tracker, I had taken a 3-mile walk at midnight 3 days ago. I had no recollection of this. The intrusions accelerated. I received a bank statement showing purchases. I hadn't made a coffee shop across town, an online subscription to a service I'd never heard of, a significant withdrawal made in person at a branch I never visited. Email confirmations arrived for job interviews I hadn't applied for my dating app. Showed conversations with women I'd never messaged someone. Something was methodically inserting itself into every aspect of my existence. In desperation, I reached out to a former colleague who had left our firm to pursue psychiatric medicine. I carefully explained my situation, describing it as disturbing dreams and lost time rather than a supernatural duplicate. His furrowed brow told me he wasn't buying the sanitized version, but he referred me to a specialist. Anyway, I never made it to the appointment. When I arrived at the office building, the receptionist greeted me by name, checking her computer before informing me my session had been completed yesterday. According to her records, I had spent 50 minutes discussing my dissociative episodes with the doctor. The bathroom at work became my sanctuary, the one place I could hide and collect myself. When the panic threatened to overwhelm me during a particularly bad episode, I splashed cold water on my face. The shock of it momentarily grounding me as I reached for a paper towel, I noticed something different about the mirror. My reflection stood perfectly still while I moved. Its expression remained neutral as horror bloomed across my actual face. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one finger to its lips, shushing me. My throat closed up completely. I couldn't even scream. "You look unwell," it said, its mouth moving while mine remained frozen in terror. The voice that emerged from its throat was mine, yet not mine. Slightly deeper, more confident. "Perhaps you should take some time off. I can handle things here." I stumbled backward, colliding with the bathroom stall door. My heart thundered so violently I feared it might rupture the thing in the mirror. Smiled my smile, but wronged too wide too, knowing, "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking, "I'm you." It replied simply, "The better version, the version everyone prefers." My legs finally gave out. I slid down the wall to the floor, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. When I managed to look up again, the mirror showed only my true reflection. Pale, sweating, crumpled on the bathroom floor. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that, I unplugged all the mirrors in my apartment, covered them with sheets. I deleted my social media accounts, disabled my email, turned off my phone. I filled my kitchen sink with water to check for my reflection. It was normal, responding to my movements as it should, but when I leaned closer, the face looking back at me seemed subtly different, more confident, healthier. The dark circles under my eyes were missing from its face that night, lying in bed with every light in the apartment blazing. I heard my front door open, the familiar sound of my own footsteps cross the living room floor, a rustling as a coat. My coat was hung on the rack. The refrigerator door opened and closed. I remained paralyzed under the covers, sweat soaking through my shirt, heart racing so fast it became one continuous roar in my ears. The bedroom door creaked open. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to face what was coming. The mattress depressed as something sat on the edge of the bed. I could smell my own cologne stronger than I ever applied it. "We need to talk," my voice said. "This isn't working for either of us." I forced my eyes open. There I sat at the foot of my own bed, not a reflection, not a hallucination, but solid flesh. My doppelganger wore my favorite gray sweater and jeans. Its hair was styled the way I always attempted, but never quite achieved it. Looked like me on my best day, the version of myself I always aspired to be. "What do you want?" I croaked, pressing myself against the headboard. "To exist," it replied, "simply to live." "I've been watching you waste this life for years. Same routine, same fears, same excuses. I can do better. I am doing better. You're stealing my life." I said, voice breaking. It shook its head, my head with what looked like genuine sympathy. "I'm improving your life. Your friends prefer me. Your colleagues respect me more. Even your mother enjoys our conversations more." It leaned closer and I could smell mint on its breath. "I'm not replacing you. I'm upgrading you." "You're not real," I whispered, more to convince myself than it. "I'm as real as you are." It extended a hand toward my face. I flinched away, but it merely brushed a tear from my cheek. Its touch was warm, solid. "We can share this life, take turns," or it smiled my smile again, but with confidence I had never possessed. "You could just rest. Let me handle things. Haven't you been tired for so long?" And I had been bone deep exhausted, worn down by the daily grind, by expectations I couldn't meet, by the constant fear of failure. The offer was tempting, to surrender to rest, to let someone more capable take over the burdens I struggled to carry. For a moment I considered it, then I noticed something strange about its eyes. Despite the perfect replication of my features, its pupils were different. Slightly elongated, almost rectangular, not human. The realization sent ice through my veins. "No," I said, my voice finding strength. "This is my life. Flawed, mundane, disappointing, but mine." Its expression hardened, the mask of sympathy falling away. "You won't have a choice much longer. I'm becoming more real every day. You're fading. Haven't you noticed? I had my interactions with others. Had become strained. People looking at me with confusion when I didn't recall conversations or plans. My keycard had stopped working at the office. My fingerprint no longer unlocked my phone consistently. The doppelganger stood straightening my sweater on its body. "I'll give you time to accept the inevitable, but not much time. You're already half gone." It left the bedroom, and moments later I heard the front door close. I remained frozen, listening to the silence of my apartment, feeling the boundaries of my existence growing thinner, less certain in the darkness of my bedroom. I held my hand up to the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. For just a moment I could swear I saw through it, as if I were becoming transparent, as if I were the reflection and it was becoming solid. I don't know how much time I have left. I write this as evidence that I existed, that I was here first. If you meet someone with my face, my name, my life, know that he is not me. Even if he has become more me than I am now, I don't know what it is or where it came from. I don't know what happens to the original when the copy takes over completely. But I know I'm still here for now, and I will not go quietly. Story 2, the old Harrington building breathes. I know this sounds insane, but after 6 weeks working here, I'm certain of it. The century-old brick and timber structure inhales during the day, walls expanding imperceptibly, floorboards stretching, and exhales at night when everyone leaves. Everyone except me is the new night manager. I'm alone when the building sighs, when the shadows thicken in corners they shouldn't. When the whispers start 3 days ago, I would have sworn to you I was a rational man. Now I'm no longer certain what I am or what's happening to me. My name is Daniel Mercer. I took this job because I needed the money. Simple as that. The ad seemed almost too perfect. Night manager position at the historic Harrington building. Minimal responsibilities, decent pay, and most importantly, plenty of quiet hours to work on my novel. The interview with Mr. Whitmore, the property owner, lasted exactly 7 minutes. His pale eyes barely looked at my resume before he handed me the keys, mentioning something about high turnover but assuring me it was nothing to worry about. I should have asked more questions. The Harrington was built in 1873. 5 stories of Victorian craftsmanship in downtown Boston, all ornate moldings and dark wood paneling. The first floor houses an antique shop and a coffee place that closes at 6 floors. 2 through 4 are rented as office spaces to various businesses. Law firms, accounting offices, a graphic design company. The 5th floor remains empty under renovation. According to Whitmore, my office sits in the basement, next to the boiler room where the building's ancient heating system clanks and groans like something dying. The oddities began subtly on my 3rd night. I noticed the temperature would drop suddenly in certain hallways, cold enough to see my breath hanging in the air only to return to normal. The moment I stepped away, I blamed the building's aging climate system. Then came the persistent feeling of being watched whenever I made my rounds. I'd spin around certain I would catch someone standing behind me only to face empty corridors. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, just me looking increasingly paranoid. My first real break with reality happened during my 2nd week. I was making notes on my manuscript when the pen jerked in my hand as if grabbed by invisible fingers. A cold sensation crawled up my arm like ice water replacing blood in my veins. My hand began moving of its own accord, scratching violent angular symbols across the page. I watched heart pounding painfully against my ribs as my own fingers created a language I'd never seen. Harsh lines and curved symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly when it stopped. My hand was shaking so badly I dropped the pen. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the desk where I left it. I didn't write anything else that night. The next morning, I showed the page to a linguistics professor at the university nearby. The woman's face went blank as she studied the symbols. Her fingers tracing them without actually touching the paper, she asked where I'd found this text. Her voice unnervingly hollow. When I mentioned the Harrington building, she handed the paper back so quickly it tore. She informed me that the symbols resembled no known language, but shared elements with certain Presumerian pictographs associated with cult practices. She wouldn't elaborate further, but suggested I reconsider my employment situation. I crumpled the paper and threw it away on my walk back to my apartment. That should have been enough warning, but I convinced myself there must be a rational explanation. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at my desk and had a vivid dream, or perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank. I couldn't afford to quit. Not with rent due and my savings nearly depleted. The memory lapses started during my 4th week. The first one lasted only minutes. I was checking the lock on the back entrance when my vision blurred and swam the corridor, elongating impossibly before me. My head filled with a low pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate my teeth. When my vision cleared, I was standing in front of the 5th floor elevator, my hand pressing against the wall where dark water stains formed concentric circles like ripples in a pond. 15 minutes had vanished completely. My fingertips were black with some substance that smelled of copper and earth. These episodes grew more frequent and longer in duration. I'd find myself in different parts of the building with no memory of how I got there. Sometimes holding objects I didn't recognize, a tarnished key, an old photograph of people with faces scratched out a child's worn leather shoe that I immediately locked in a storage closet and haven't opened since my skin crawled with the certainty that during these blackouts I wasn't alone in my body. The reactions from the daytime employees made things worse. Marissa from the legal office on the 3rd floor asked if I was feeling all right after finding me staring at a blank wall one morning, unresponsive to her questions. Apparently, I'd been standing there for at least 20 minutes the next day. She wouldn't meet my eyes, hurrying past with her hand clutching a small silver cross. The security guard, Thomas, cornered me in the parking lot. Last week, he described how he'd reviewed footage from a camera malfunctioning on the 4th floor and saw me walking backward down the hallway at 3 a.m. My head turned 180 degrees, whispering to the ceiling when he showed me the footage. The screen displayed only static. Thomas quit the following day. My own appearance has begun to frighten me. The mirror shows a gaunt face with sunken eyes, skin too pale, movements too jerky. Sometimes when I catch my reflection in the polished brass elevator doors, I swear my mirror image hesitates a fraction of a second before mimicking my movements. Yesterday, I thought I saw it smile when I wasn't smiling. The most terrifying incident happened 3 nights ago. I was making my rounds on the second floor when I heard something heavy being dragged across the floor above me. The sound moved deliberately from one end of the ceiling to the other, followed by 3 distinct knocks. The rational part of my brain suggested it might be the building settling or pipes expanding, but the primitive part of me, the part connected to ancient instincts, knew something was moving up there. I forced myself to investigate my flashlight beam trembling across darkened offices and conference rooms. I found nothing on the third floor nor on the fourth, the fifth floor. The supposedly empty floor was locked. As always, I stood outside its heavy oak doors, my entire body vibrating with dread. The brass handle was ice cold against my palm as I tested it. Finding it locked, I should have been relieved. Instead, I pressed my ear against the door. At first, I heard nothing, then a soft shuffling like many feet moving across carpet. A low murmur of voices speaking in that same strange language my hand had written. My breath caught in my throat as something on the other side pressed against the door, something heavy and solid. The wood creaked inward slightly. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. The voices stopped. Then a single knock from inside the door. Another, a third. Exactly like the pattern I'd heard from below, I ran. My feet pounded down the stairs, sweat pouring down my back. Despite the freezing air, I locked myself in my basement office, pushed my desk against the door, and huddled in the corner until morning. When daylight came, I convinced myself I'd experienced some sort of waking nightmare sleep deprivation and stressed nothing more. But that night, I discovered something that shattered my ability to rationalize while searching old building records for information about previous night managers. I found a hidden compartment in my desk drawer. Inside was a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. The handwriting inside matched mine exactly, not similar, identical, down to how I cross my T's and the slight upward curve of my Y's. The journal detailed the same experiences I'd been having, the same phenomena, the same growing terror. It was dated 1922. The entries described how the writer, a man named Daniel Mercer, had discovered that the Harrington building had been constructed over the foundation of something much older, something that had been a temple or meeting place for people who worshipped entities that existed in the spaces between walls. In the shadows between moments, the final entry described how Mercer planned to seal the fifth floor permanently and escape the building's influence. The handwriting deteriorated toward the end, devolving into those same angular symbols. My hand had produced the final page contained only one sentence in English. It wears us like gloves. I haven't slept in 36 hours. My hands shake constantly now, twice today. I've caught myself writing those symbols again without realizing it. The building seems to pulse around me, the walls breathing faster, more hungrily. The whispers are constant now. Even when I press my hands over my ears, they're coming from inside my head. I'm writing this account as a warning. I've decided to leave tonight, to walk out and never return. I've placed my resignation letter on Whitmore's desk along with the keys and security codes. I won't even go back to my office to collect my things, whatever exists in this building. Whatever has existed here since before the building itself wants something from me, from us, from all the Daniel Mercers who have worked here. But as I finish writing this, sitting in the coffee shop on the first floor, I feel a familiar coldness creeping up my arms. My vision is beginning to blur. I recognize the signs. Now an episode is coming, one of those lost periods of time I need to get out now before I find myself at my desk in the basement office. The doors are locked from the inside. My resignation letter sits in front of me, torn to pieces on the wall. Written in what looks like ash are symbols I now understand perfectly. They tell me that I have always been here, that we have always been here, that there is no Daniel Mercer except the one that exists to serve as vessel. The building exhales around me as night falls. I hear footsteps on the ceiling above. They're coming down from the fifth floor. The whispers tell me it's time to open the door. My hands move toward the keys without my permission. Part of me screams to resist. But another part, a growing part, welcomes what's coming after. All I've been hosting this entity for longer than I realized, perhaps not just in this lifetime, but in others. The footsteps have reached the basement stairs, something scrapes against the door. 3 knocks in that familiar pattern, my hand reaches for the lock. Maybe I'll become something new, maybe I always was. The door is opening now. Story 3, the air changed. First one moment I was hiking the familiar Oakwood Trail, the next. I was breathing something that felt thicker, as if each lungful carried a subtle weight. I couldn't quite identify that was my first clue, though. I wasn't aware enough to recognize it yet. The trail looked identical. Same dirt path winding through towering pines, same rocky outcroppings dotting the landscape. But that sky, that impossible wrong sky, glowed with a sickly amber hue that shouldn't exist in nature, like jaundice skin stretched across the horizon. I checked my watch, 2:17 p.m., yet the light filtering through the canopy above suggested the cusp of evening or perhaps dawn, a transitional illumination that belonged to neither day nor night. I've hiked this trail dozens of times, 23 to be exact. I'm methodical that way. Keeping count of such things each time, I documented the experience in my trail journal: weather conditions, wildlife sightings, notable geological features. Nothing in those meticulous records prepared me for this. Nothing could have the first anomaly beyond the sky was subtle. A cardinal that flitted between trees ahead of me. I noticed its movement was unusual. The bird appeared on one branch, then instantly on another 10 feet away without crossing the space between my eyes. Struggled to track it as if it existed in frames rather than continuous motion. I blamed eye fatigue, dehydration. Perhaps I stopped to drink from my water bottle, the familiar ritual momentarily grounding me in. Normally, the water tasted metallic, almost bloody. I spat it out, watching as it seeped into the dirt with unusual slowness. I should have turned back. Then every instinct screamed for retreat, but curiosity, that damned human flaw, pushed me forward. Just a little further, I told myself, just to see what's around the next bend. The temperature dropped several degrees in an instant. No gradual cooling, but an abrupt shift, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath fogged before me in ghostly plumes that lingered too long in the air, twisting into shapes that almost resembled letters. Before dissipating, the silence hit me next, the absolute absence of sound. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no distant highway noise that normally penetrated even this remote stretch of woodland. The silence had weight presence. It pressed against my eardrums until I could hear only my own heartbeat, unnaturally loud and increasingly rapid. I called out, my voice emerging weak and thin. "Hello, is anyone there?" The words died inches from my lips, as if the air itself swallowed them. That's when I first heard it, my name whispered from somewhere behind me. Not English. Not any language I recognized yet. I understood it perfectly. I spun around, finding nothing but empty trails stretching behind me. The whisper came again, this time from my left, then my right. Then seemingly from inside my own head, multiple voices overlapping, speaking in that impossible language that I somehow comprehended. Without knowing a single word of it, they were calling me deeper into the woods. They were warning me to flee. They were welcoming me home. All these contradictory messages simultaneously, each as clear as the next. My temples throbbed with the beginnings of a migraine. My vision blurring at the edges, I stumbled forward, determined to reach the familiar lookout point half a mile ahead. Once there, I reasoned I'd be able to see the town below, reorient myself. Find my way back to normality. The path began to twist in ways I didn't remember, making sharp turns where I recalled gentle curves. Each time I rounded a bend, expecting the lookout clearing, I found only more forest, deeper and darker than before. The trees. Dear God, the trees. I'll never forget the moment I realized they were watching me. It started with a strange creaking sound, like old wood bending under stress. I glanced up to see a massive oak slowly rotating on its axis, its trunk contorting impossibly without disturbing its roots. Its knots and whorls rearranged themselves into something unmistakably face-like. Hollow depressions forming eye sockets that tracked my movement. Another tree did the same, then another, until the entire forest seemed alive with these wooden sentinels, their limbs straining toward me, their improvised faces expressing emotions I wouldn't interpret my rational mind. Grasp for explanations, hallucination, undiagnosed medical condition, contaminated water from my bottle. None satisfied, the evidence of my senses was too consistent, too persistent to dismiss. My hands trembled as I checked my phone. No service, of course, but also no battery, though it had been fully charged when I started this hike. My watch had stopped at 2:17, its second hand twitching back and forth over the same spot as if trapped in amber. I tried running, the exertion felt wrong, like moving through honey, each step requiring extraordinary effort. My lungs burned, not with the familiar pain of exertion, but with something deeper, as if the air itself was caustic sweat poured off me cold and viscous, leaving iridescent trails on my skin that reflected that sick amber light from above. It was during this desperate sprint that I first saw my pursuer, just a glimpse at first, a tall, spindly figure at the periphery of my vision. Each time I turned to look directly at it, it vanished only to reappear at another impossible angle above me in the branches around a corner. I hadn't yet reached reflected in a puddle where nothing stood to cast such a reflection. I couldn't make out details, just an impression of wrongness. Limbs too long and jointed in places. Limbs shouldn't joint a head that seemed to consist mostly of vertical opening, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. I fell, my ankle twisted on an exposed root, or did the root raise itself to trip me on hands and knees? I raised my head to find the entity standing directly before me, no longer hiding in peripheral vision. Its form made no anatomical sense, segments of it existing in contradictory perspective, simultaneously, as if assembled from multiple camera angles of the same impossible being. It had no eyes that I could discern, yet I felt seen, not just externally, but internally, examining not just my body, but the very architecture of my consciousness. My mouth dried instantly. My heart hammered so violently I feared it might tear itself from my chest. A high-pitched keening filled my ears, which I realized with horror was coming from my own throat. I scrambled backward, fingernails breaking as they clawed at the dirt and stone. The thing spoke my name again in that language. I shouldn't understand it. Told me I had crossed a threshold few humans ever find, and fewer still recognize when they do it. Told me reality is not a solid thing, but a consensus, a shared agreement, and that I had wandered into a place where different rules applied, where different beings had formed their own consensus about how existence should operate. It told me I was a visitor, but could become a permanent resident. If I accepted certain changes to my fundamental nature, I managed to ask through lips numb with terror, what would happen if I refused? The entity made a sound like stone grinding against stone laughter. I realized with a fresh wave of revulsion the forest itself seemed to laugh with it. Trees swaying in a wind, I couldn't feel their wooden faces contorting in mirth. The ground beneath me, softened, began to part, like lips preparing to swallow me whole in desperation. I lunged past the entity, finding my feet again and sprinting deeper into the forest, away from the trail, away from any hope of finding my way back, driven purely by animal terror. Time lost, meaning I might have run for minutes or hours. The amber light never faded, maintaining that eternal dusk-dawn quality. Occasionally I'd spot landmarks I recognized from earlier, the same distinctive rock formation, the same fallen log suggesting I was moving in circles. Despite my best efforts to maintain a straight course, the whispering voices grew more numerous, more insistent. The trees continued their impossible contortions to watch my progress, and always my pursuer would appear and disappear at random intervals, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, sometimes impossible distances away, yet completely distinct, sometimes so close I could feel a coldness radiating from it. My strength began to fail, my legs burned, my lungs heaved, my vision tunneled. I collapsed against a tree trunk, immediately regretting it. When I felt the wood shift against my back, molding itself around me in a grotesque embrace, I pushed away, stumbling into a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the center stood a simple wooden door frame, just the frame. No door, no surrounding structure, standing erect as if built there. Though it clearly wasn't attached to anything through it, I could see the normal trail, the normal sky, the normal forest. I had started in Salvation just steps away. I approached cautiously. Suspecting a trap, the entity appeared beside the doorframe. Its impossible geometry somehow even more pronounced now, as if it was struggling to maintain any semblance of three-dimensional form. It explained in that language I impossibly understood that thresholds work both ways. I had crossed unwittingly, I could cross back intentionally, but having seen what lies beyond the consensus reality, I would never be able to unsee it. The threshold would always be visible to me now, and others like it scattered throughout the world. My jaw-clenched skin crawling with revulsion, both at the entity's proximity and its implication. Did I want to know that such places existed? That reality itself was so fragile, so permeable, that beings like this lurk just beyond the edge of normal perception. Knowledge has a price, ignorance its own cost. I asked why it was letting me go. The entity's form fluctuated, parts of it seeming to recede into dimensions I couldn't perceive before snapping back into visibility. It conveyed that I was more useful as a messenger than as a captive. Those who wander back serve as warnings, as seeds of doubt in the collective human consensus. Each person who glimpses beyond the threshold weakens the boundary for all. With that chilling revelation, I stumbled through the doorframe, feeling a momentary resistance, like pushing through a membrane, then sudden release as I emerged back onto the familiar trail. The normal blue sky overhead nearly brought me to tears of relief. My phone buzzed in my pocket, service restored battery mysteriously full. My watch ticked again, though it now read 6:43 p.m. over 4 hours. Lost in that other place, I half ran, half limped back toward the trailhead, toward civilization, toward everything solid and real and agreed upon only once. Did I glance back, seeing nothing but ordinary forest behind me, yet something caught my eye at the periphery of my vision. A simple wooden doorframe standing between two distant trees, barely visible through the foliage. I've told no one about what happened. Who would believe me? I've resumed my life, my job, my relationships. Everything appears normal, but I see them now, thresholds everywhere in the corner of my basement where the shadows never quite disperse in the space between. Two buildings downtown that seems deeper than it should be in the peculiar arrangement of trees in the park that frames emptiness in a very specific way. Doorways to elsewhere, hiding in plain sight. Sometimes in quiet moments I hear the whispers again, that language I shouldn't understand calling my name, inviting me back. Sometimes I catch glimpses of watchers at the corner of my vision, gone when I turn to look directly. Sometimes I wonder if I truly escaped, or if that's simply what they wanted me to believe. And sometimes, God help me, I find myself drawn to those thresholds, wondering what other realities might lie beyond them. What other consensuses exist alongside our own knowledge? Once gained creates its own terrible hunger. The entity knew this. Perhaps that's why it let me go. I keep this journal now as a warning. Though I don't know who I'm warning, or why, if you found it and are reading these words, then perhaps you too have glimpsed beyond a threshold. Perhaps you too now see the doorframe standing where nothing should stand. Perhaps you too hear the whispers. If so, I have only this advice: when something inside you begins to yearn for that amber light, when the whispers start to make a terrible kind of sense run, run toward the solid, the agreed upon, the consensus reality we all share, because I'm not sure how much longer I can resist the call to step through once more. And next time, I don't think I'll be allowed to return. Story 4, a damp, stale odor assaulted my nostrils the moment I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk that night, as though the very air in that deserted part of town was weighed down by something rotten. Every shadow across the street seemed to shift slightly whenever I looked away, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move from the corner of my vision. I caught a flicker, just a passing figure, I told myself, but my pulse already pounded in my ears, making it difficult to focus. I'd come here, despite my better judgment, to buy a pair of tickets from a stranger whose appearance seemed to change each time we met. Now I stood in front of what was supposed to be the ticket exchange location, An aged theater with shattered windows and sagging walls, the marquee letters missing or arranged in incomprehensible patterns. It was then in that moment of oppressive silence that I knew I had made a profound mistake. I remember the adrenaline rush coursing through my veins when I first saw that online listing, hard to find tickets. No event specified, yet something in the description called out to me, perhaps the promise of a once-in-a-lifetime show or the thrill of obtaining a secret performance seat. I was bored with my life, tired of the mundane routine, so I jumped at the chance for something unusual. The phone call that came soon after was brief. I heard a raspy voice quoting a modest price and instructing me to meet at an out-of-the-street corner. No official vendor, no tickets, just a hush transaction. My heartbeat was surprisingly loud in my chest as I agreed to the covert deal. The first time I saw the seller, I was sure something about him didn't quite match his own silhouette. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that threw a long shadow over his features at one angle. I could have sworn he was clean-shaven, a face with a sharp chin and gaunt cheeks. When I blinked, the face seemed rounder with a slight mustache. I tried to chalk it up to poor lighting or my own nerves making my perception fuzzy. Still, a chill crept up my spine when he handed me two small tattered tickets. He never named the show. He gave me a time, a date, and a second address with instructions to pick up the actual program. It sounded strange. Why not just give me everything at once? His response was cryptic, but in my anxious excitement, I ignored every warning sign. People sometimes do illogical things when they're bored or desperate, and I was both. So I took the tickets. A short, breathy laugh escaped him as I left. I still hear it echo in my nightmares on the appointed evening. The second address led me to this rotting theater. The facade seemed older than any building I'd ever seen. The ornate columns crumbling at the edges, the plaster chipped away to reveal wire mesh and rotted wood. The double doors were locked, but a side entrance stood ajar, its wood dark with what might have been water damage or mold. I slipped inside one part, curiosity, two parts dread. Unable to shake the heaviness in the air that clung to my skin like a cold sweat. I expected dust and webs, which were indeed plentiful, but the place was otherwise eerily intact. Faded posters lined the hallway, each one promoting shows from decades ago featuring names I didn't recognize and dates stretching back to the 70s. My eyes scanned the dim corridor, reading fragments of old play titles. My heart was racing, and I could taste metallic anxiety on my tongue, as if my entire body was bracing for something. My phone's flashlight flickered, reflecting off the shattered frames. Then for a split second, I caught a glimpse of a silhouette in the reflection. Someone behind me. I whipped around and found no one there. My breath stuck in my throat. I recalled the instructions. Go to the stage, present your tickets. That's what the stranger had said, though I wasn't sure to whom I was supposed to present them. The concession stands were roped off with dusty velvet cords. The seats beyond the main entrance arch remained hidden in the dark. My footsteps echoed ominously on the old tile floor as I made my way toward the main auditorium. The door creaked loudly, sending a jolt of terror through my chest as I stepped inside. What I found behind those doors made my stomach clench. The stage lights were on, casting a wavering glow on a group of translucent performers, a surreal ensemble wearing old-fashioned costumes. They moved slowly, as if stuck in a loop of gestures and steps. It took several seconds for my mind to register that what I was seeing was real, yet impossible. They were only partially there, their outlines flickering like poor reception on an ancient television. The seats in front of them were filled with what looked like silhouettes, undefined dark forms that gave the unsettling impression of an enthralled audience. None of them reacted to my entrance. Each figure faced the stage backs, turned to me as if ignoring the intrusion of the living. My heart hammered so hard in my chest I thought it would bruise my ribs from the inside. A clammy sweat coated my palms. I tried to call for help, but my voice came out a croak of breath that barely left my throat. Breathing heavily, I found a side aisle and moved away from the stage, hoping there might be some exit that didn't require me to get closer to those shadowy figures. Just as I was about to try a side door, I felt a presence behind me. A soft whispery sound that might have been a voice. I spun around, nearly dropping my phone, and found nothing. The lights on stage flickered and the cast of phantoms repeated their dance, stepping in the exact same pattern as before. I clutched my phone more for comfort than illumination at that point and tried to call someone. Anyone. The screen displayed a strong signal, yet all I got was static. My heart lurched as I saw the date on my text messages. 1978. Every attempt to send a message simply returned a bizarre error code. The timestamp locked in an era decades gone. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my breathing ragged and my skin breaking out in a frigid sweat. My hand started trembling, the device slipping in my grip, and I realized with growing terror that I was alone with something I couldn't understand. Attempting to ground myself, I repeated in my head that none of this could be real. Perhaps the building's interior was rigged with elaborate holograms, a bizarre art installation designed to unnerve unsuspecting trespassers that had to be it right. But then I heard soft footsteps. Someone was walking across the stage, blending in and out of the flickering performers as if caught between their world and mine. I thought it might be the stranger who sold me the tickets, but every time the figure turned, its form seemed to shift. Face elongating, then contracting, my stomach flipped, and the sensation of pins and needles crept along my neck. I tore my gaze away from the stage and spotted a door labeled Exit. In faint chipped letters with a desperate burst of adrenaline, I bolted. Every step echoed unnaturally as though the hallway itself was stretching. My lungs burned, and I could hear my breath rasping in my ears. I stumbled into the exit door, pushing it with all my might. It gave way, and a rush of damp night air hit my face. Relief fluttered in my chest until I realized I was standing on stage facing the flickering orchestra of translucent performers. Somehow the door had led me back to the exact same point I was trying to escape. The stage beneath my feet was oddly solid, though a thick layer of dust covered the wooden planks. I could sense the presence of an audience behind me, silent and waiting. Fear clawed at my mind, and I dared not turn around. Instead, I stepped carefully off the stage and back into the aisles, each seat still filled with a shadow-like form. No matter which door I chose, no matter which hallway I wandered, I always emerged again behind the curtains or beside the stage. Confronted with the eternal performance looping under that sickly glow, it became difficult to tell how much time was passing. My own breathing seemed off rhythm, and my heart pounded relentlessly as if preparing to burst. I tried to calm myself by reviewing each step I'd taken in my head, but the corridors felt mismatched, the architecture illogical. My phone's clock was useless. Stuck in 1978, the battery meter never seemed to drop, and all attempts at calling for help continued to produce only that oppressive static. At one point, I remember reaching out to one of the shadowy audience members, hoping against hope that they were just people in costume. My hand moved through it like a dark fog, a coldness, sweeping across my fingers that made my entire body shudder. I let out a strangled gasp. My chest felt tight, and for a moment I thought I might black out. Fighting the urge to faint, I stumbled backward, nearly collapsing onto a row of threadbare seats with each failed escape attempt. My paranoia soared. I started hearing scrapes along the walls, or faint voices calling my name in rasping tones. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. It was as if my body had turned on survival mode, flooding itself with adrenaline, leaving me shaky and disoriented in the swirling haze of fear. I started questioning my own eyes. I would see glimpses of a man in the corner, sometimes in a top hat, sometimes in ragged casual clothes. Each time I tried to approach him, he vanished like a mirage. Eventually, my chest tight and my muscles weak. I sat on a dusty seat in the last row. The flickering performance continued. The actors' faces blank and unreadable. Their movements had a tragic grace, a repetition that felt both mesmerizing and sickening. I found myself staring at them. Lost in the loop of their silent gestures, my mind drifted to the phone in my pocket, and I pulled it out again. The static was still hissing, an incessant drone that seemed to warp into faint whispers. If I listened too long, then I remembered the text messages and decided in a moment of half-delirious curiosity to send one to a friend I knew would be home. I typed something along the lines of, "Help me, I'm stuck in an old theater." The sent timestamp read August 14th, 1978. I stared at it, the letter shimmering like a relic from a different life. Then the phone vibrated. A new text message appeared. It was from an unknown number, also dated 1978. The content nearly illegible jumbled letters with random punctuation. I felt a surge of dread so powerful I nearly dropped the phone. The sense of being completely unmed from reality grew stronger. My stomach churned. I couldn't stay put. Every second in that seat felt like hours. I stood and moved deeper into the theater's backstage area, deciding to explore every inch until I found a real exit. The backstage corridor was lined with moth-eaten costumes on racks. Each costume looked from a different era: faded flapper dresses, elaborate Victorian suits, glimmering disco outfits at times. I felt the garments sway on their hangers when I passed, as though invisible hands were nudging them. My breath caught in my throat, and I gripped the phone like a talisman against whatever forces clung to this cursed place past the wardrobe. I found a door leading to what might have been an office. The door doorknob was cold, but it turned with relative ease, revealing a cluttered room with an overturned desk, battered filing cabinets, and reams of old newspapers stacked haphazardly. My hands trembled as I lifted a yellowed newspaper from the top of a pile. The headline was from 1978, describing a theater closure after an incident that authorities refused to detail. There was no mention of casualties, only that the building was condemned. My vision blurred for a moment, fear tangling with confusion. Every rational thought told me this was all a bizarre trick, yet the creeping dread in my gut insisted otherwise. Though the flickering overhead bulb threatened to go out, I saw a small window behind the desk. It was boarded up from the outside, but a sliver of moonlight slipped through with renewed resolve. I tried to pry the boards loose using a rusted crowbar. I found leaning against a cabinet, my palms grew slick with sweat. As I exerted every ounce of strength, the boards refused to budge, and the faint illumination disappeared, replaced by a swirling darkness that formed shapes at the edge of my vision. My arm shook and I lost my grip on the crowbar, the clang echoing unnaturally in my peripheral vision. I noticed the silhouette again. The man who had sold me the tickets, he was standing behind me in the shadows, still changing shape. I heard a faint voice, a soft mocking laughter that made my skin prickle. A surge of primal terror spurred me into running. Battered though I was, I burst from the office into another series of corridors. Every so often, a flicker of that same stranger's face appeared in the far corner, a reminder of his shifting form. My breathing was ragged, my chest pounding painfully. I stopped trying doors. They all led to the stage. I could hear the phantom applause before I even reached the handle. At last, my eyes fell upon a cracked window in what appeared to be an old lounge area. It was large enough for me to climb through if I could break it. Grabbing a nearby chair, I swung with all the energy I had left, and the glass shattered. A biting wind rushed in, carrying the smell of damp midnight air. Without hesitation, I scrambled through the opening, ignoring the shards that cut my hands and tore at my clothes. My lungs seized with relief when my feet hit asphalt. I bolted away from the theater, not stopping until I reached the main road. The building receded behind me like a looming specter, its broken windows glaring in the moonlight. I collapsed onto the curb, panting, my heart beating a wild rhythm. My phone beeped again, startling me, but this time the static was gone. The screen showed the correct date. My messages were normal, as though I'd just stepped out for a moment. I was left with no sense of resolution, only a lingering sense of being touched by something that defied comprehension. Sleep eluded me for nights afterward, my mind replaying the endless performance, the translucent dancers, and the shifting face of the ticket seller. Even now, I can't decide whether I escaped that cursed place in truth or if part of me remains trapped within its labyrinthine halls. A creeping unease still clings to me, making every shadow in my apartment feel like a watcher, every reflection a potential opening to that dreadful stage, and so I live with the knowledge that some doors once opened never fully close. There's an aftertaste of otherworldly dread that follows me wherever I go. The memory of that theater haunts the corners of my dreams, filling me with the inescapable certainty that no matter how many times I tell myself I'm free, I can still sense the hush of an endless crowd, the flicker of phantom lights, and the silent repetition of a performance that never truly ends. My hands tense at the mere thought of it, my breath catching my pulse, racing a lingering terror that begs the question, if ever summoned again, would I be able to resist that ticket? Or has the show already chosen me as part of its eternal cast story? I remember the first night I slept in that old house. The walls seemed alive, creaking with a kind of dismal, secretive rhythm, like they were murmuring confessions. I wasn't meant to hear. The wind rattled the loose window frames, and I found myself jolting awake repeatedly, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. From the moment I set foot inside, I sensed something was off about the place, something that clung to the corners and hid in the rafters. Back then, I couldn't articulate why it felt so suffocating now. I'm certain it was the first whisper of the nightmare awaiting me in the attic, a silent invitation that would unravel everything I thought I knew about reality. I had bought the property for a good price, deciding to remodel and fix it up for my own use. It was supposed to be my safe haven. I didn't anticipate that I'd discover any hidden chambers, let alone a portal to alternate versions of my life. But that's exactly what happened when I pried open the attic door. For the first time, I had no clue it concealed an impossible entryway to shifting realities. Even recalling those first moments in the attic sets, my nerves on edge, my pulse speeds up and my hands go cold. Just thinking about it, the attic itself was cramped with slanted ceilings that forced me to stoop. Rusty nails jutted out of the beams, and the single light bulb flickered overhead, casting elongated shadows that seemed to twist whenever I wasn't looking. The smell was thick and stagnant, reminding me of old paper left in a damp basement. For too long, I climbed the rickety ladder expecting to find forgotten furniture or boxes filled with musty clothes. Instead, I found a circular trap door in the far corner, almost hidden behind stacks of splintered wood planks. It looked out of place, too new and polished to belong to that decrepit space. My pulse quickened as a tiny voice in my head said, I shouldn't open it yet. Curiosity gnawed at me until I lifted the handle and descended into the darkness below. I found myself in what appeared to be the house's second-floor hallway, but something was off. The hallway rug was a different color, a deep burgundy with gold thread. Rather than the threadbare brown one I had downstairs, I told myself I must have stumbled into an unused section of the house, maybe an extension or a sealed wing. But my rationalizations didn't hold up when I noticed that the paint on the walls looked fresh. My entire body tensed. My breathing became shallow and a slick layer of sweat formed on the back of my neck. I tried to calm my heartbeat by counting backward from 10, but I only made it to 7 before I spun around to retrace my steps, only to find that the ladder I had just climbed was gone. A surge of panic turned my legs wobbly. My throat felt parched. I could hear my own breathing echo, every breath sounding too loud in the suffocating stillness. Then I saw something even more jarring: family photographs on the wall. My face stared back at me from the frames flanked by people I had never laid eyes on. My chest constricted. I couldn't recall these strangers yet. There I was, beaming in each picture, apparently living a life that wasn't mine. Terrified, I staggered through that unfamiliar hallway, nearly stumbling over a pair of shoes left by a door. The old wood creaked beneath me, and each footstep sounded magnified, like the house wanted to broadcast my presence to something lurking. At last, I found a staircase, dashed down, and burst into what should have been my living room, except the furniture was rearranged. My couch, once against the window, stood in the center of the room. The wallpaper was a pattern I'd never seen before. The strong odor of bleach hung in the air. I felt dazed, and icy pressure weighing on my chest. My thoughts raced in circles. I was in my house, and yet I wasn't, with trembling hands. I searched for the front door. Even the door's color looked different now, a glossy black instead of its original peeling green. I flung it open and stepped outside, desperate for any sign of the neighborhood. Somehow the street aligned with my memory, but the streetlights were older and the sidewalk had a fresh coat of paint marking new lines. It was jarring. Everything was close to normal, but not quite. As I stood there breathing heavily, I felt an abrupt wave of dizziness wash over me in a burst of blind instinct. I rushed back inside, bounding up the stairs to find any pathway to the attic. My chest heaved with every step, the pounding of my heart resonating in my ears. My nerves hummed like a taut string about to snap. Finally, I spotted a trapdoor in the ceiling of an upstairs bedroom, forcing it open. I climbed through a narrow hatch to a dimly lit attic that resembled the one I had originally left. The smell of stale air and mold returned. The rickety ladder was there again, and I practically fell down its steps, colliding with dusty floorboards. When my vision cleared, I saw I was back in my attic, the real attic, or so I hoped. My hand shook so violently I could barely hold on to the old beam for support. A nervous laugh bubbled in my throat, tinged with hysteria. I kept telling myself that maybe I had dozed off and dreamed the entire thing yet. When I exited the attic, my living room and hallway were exactly as I knew them. Nothing looked out of place, except for one small detail. The light fixture in the hallway had changed from brass to a simple white dome, and I knew it had been brass just hours before. Over the following days, I became obsessed with renovating the place, not because I longed to fix it up, but because I wanted to see if anything else had altered. Every morning, I woke to discover tiny discrepancies. The door knobs were a different shape than the day before the fridge had moved to the opposite side of the kitchen. The paint on the bedroom walls seemed a shade lighter. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Stress could cause lapses in memory. Fatigue might have been warping my observations, but deep down I felt that same stomach-knotting unease. Each time I noticed a change, the air seemed thick with tension, and I was never fully at ease. Even when I sat on my couch, glancing wearily at the corners of the room, half expecting them to shift. Before my very eyes, I told a friend about the strange experiences, but only in vague terms, feigning that I found old passages and might be hallucinating from fumes in the house. I barely registered his actual reply. I kept hearing my own hammering heartbeat, my mind drifting toward the attic, picturing that gleaming trap door. Later, I overheard him mentioning that I needed professional help. He meant well, but it only fueled my paranoia. Was I losing my grip on reality, or was there truly something lurking up there? Eventually, I decided to confront it. I climbed back into the attic, physically trembling, my throat dry as dust. The flickering light bulb lent only the barest illumination, distorting the shapes around me until I could have sworn they were moving. The floorboards moaned with each step, and the nails in the beam seemed like metallic teeth poised to bite if I ventured too close. Then I saw the trap door again, that polished circular hatch mocking me from across the attic. My gut twisted with dread. I thought if I could just understand it, maybe I could seal it off or destroy it. I touched its handle immediately, feeling a coldness spread through my fingertips. My breath caught and a wave of nausea hit, as if my body were protesting what I was about to do. Yet I braced myself and descended again. This time I emerged in a version of my house that was completely abandoned. Torn wallpaper and shattered glass littered the floors. No trace of furniture remained, and the windows were broken, letting in a chilling draft. The hush was suffocating, broken only by the shuffling of debris whenever I stepped. My pulse thundered in my ears, and each inhalation felt like breathing shards of ice. I made my way through the wrecked rooms, each more derelict than the last. My skin clammy and tingling. It felt as though something was watching me from behind every fractured door or around every dimly lit corner. Still, I pressed on. I had to find another attic entrance. A path back then, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of a broken mirror leaning against the wall. It wore my face, but the eyes were hollow, as if their light had been extinguished. I spun around, chest constricting in terror, only to find nothing behind me. Yet the reflection remained in my peripheral vision, a fleeting suggestion of an impossibility. My breathing grew ragged, and the floor felt unsteady beneath me, as though the house itself was coming alive to reject my presence. Desperate, I searched every corner until at last I discovered a hatch in what used to be the foyer ceiling. The ladder leading up there was snapped, so I had to stack broken chairs to reach it. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges and I nearly slipped twice. Each time adrenaline surged through me, my body shaking uncontrollably with a frenzied scramble. I pulled myself through the narrow opening. The attic was dark, colder than ice, and silent. The suffocating sensation only intensified as if some invisible force was pressing against my chest. I inched forward in the gloom, heart hammering. Then an identical trapdoor materialized in the far corner. Almost falling over my own feet in haste, I lunged for it, praying that it led back to my original house. The moment I opened it, I felt a rush of musty air, followed by the familiar flicker of a single weak bulb relief, nearly sent me collapsing onto the attic floor of what I desperately hoped was my real home. Once I descended the ladder into my hallway, I noticed more changes. The sofa was now a different shade, and a large painting I'd never seen before hung over the fireplace. My entire body was shaking, a cold sweat matting my hair against my scalp. My lungs felt like they were trying to drag in more oxygen than they could hold, but at least this place seemed inhabited with the electricity working and no broken windows in sight. I tried to rationalize that maybe this was close enough. Perhaps I'd be safe here, but dreadnought at the back of my mind telling me that with each visit to the attic, I moved further away from whatever reality I started in. I became a recluse. The phone rang occasionally, numbers I didn't recognize. Sometimes I'd pick up hearing voices that spoke my name in confused tones, asking why I hadn't shown up to prior engagements. Other times I would just stand there, the receiver trembling in my hand, too petrified to speak. I rarely went outside, and when I did, I noticed subtle differences in the world around me. Street names spelled differently, neighbors who seemed to know me too well, or not at all. My reflection in windows and mirrors appeared strained, as though something behind my eyes had changed. Each time my heart galloped in my chest, my breathing fractured like shards of glass in my throat. At night I heard faint scraping sounds in the attic. It kept me on edge, stomach clenched in perpetual dread. The illusions or realities had started to bleed into my dreams. I dreamt of that polished trap door beckoning me in. Those dreams I'd see numerous versions of myself. Wandering halls of identical houses, our eyes never quite meeting. I'd wake soaked in sweat nails, digging into my palms, certain that if I went back into that attic, I might never find my original home again. Eventually the day came when I realized I couldn't live like that any longer. My heart was in a constant state of panic. My nerves felt raw, and every sound made me jump. The only option was to face the attic one last time, either to destroy that cursed portal or understand how to lock it permanently. I steeled myself, forcing my feet to move. Despite the cold sweat coating my forehead, my pulse roared in my ears as I climbed the rickety ladder once more. Stepping into that stale, claustrophobic space, this time the attic seemed unusually still, as if holding its breath in anticipation. That flickering light bulb was gone, leaving me with only a flashlight I'd brought. The beam quivered as I swept it across the dusty rafters, every shadow appearing to slither out of range. My mouth went dry as I spotted the trapdoor gleaming. Taunting me, sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and my heart pounded so forcefully that my limbs felt weak. I forced myself to cross the attic, each board creaking under my weight, my breathing ragged and shallow. I was certain something was watching me, but I couldn't see it. Only sense an uneasy presence shifting in the darkness. When I placed my hand on the trapdoor handle, a wave of dizziness rolled through me. My legs nearly gave out, but I clung to a beam until the nausea subsided. I told myself I had to do this. No more running, no more hiding in half-real living rooms fighting the urge to recoil. I opened the hatch and braced myself for whatever lay beyond. I was greeted by a swirling darkness, as though I were peering into a void. I held my breath, uncertain if I'd made a mistake. Then a faint light flickered, revealing an endless corridor lined with portraits. My face in each frame, some looked older or younger, some smiling, some scowling. A cold dread slithered down my spine. My hands shook and my vision blurred momentarily as I tried to focus. The corridor drew me in step by tentative step. My heart slammed against my ribcage so hard I thought it would burst. It felt as though I were walking into my own mind or 1,000 different versions of it. As I made my way down that surreal hallway, I recognized pieces of furniture from other realities. I'd visited a battered ottoman, a vase I had once glimpsed in a different living room. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost breathing. In tandem with my panicked breaths, my flashlight dimmed its battery, failing at the worst moment. Each time it flickered, the corridor changed length, making me disoriented and nauseous. My skin prickled and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. I realized that might not help. There was no guarantee I could even find the trapdoor again. I pressed forward until I reached a threshold, a doorway with a thick swirling darkness that reminded me of ink. A subtle hum filled the air, vibrating in my chest and teeth. My palms were clammy and goosebumps erupted along my arms with a deep, shaky breath. I stepped through, bracing for the worst. Instead, I found myself back in an attic that looked normal. No swirling shadows, no flickering corridor, only dust motes floating in the beam of my faltering flashlight. My heart hammered painfully, expecting something terrifying to leap out. Nothing did. The hush was absolute. I pulled down the ladder and descended into a hallway that at a glance seemed exactly like the one I remembered from the very beginning. The scuffed flooring, the peeling wallpaper, the brass light fixture. My living room was arranged as I'd originally placed it, with my old couch and the faded rug. Even my fridge was back to its usual spot in the kitchen. I took a moment to test the light switches, open cabinets, glance at photos on the wall, pictures of me alone or with friends. I actually recognized my chest felt tight with hope, but also with an apprehension that any second something might shift again. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. My legs trembled and my breath wavered between relief and panic. Had I finally returned, or was this yet another dimension? With differences I hadn't noticed yet, the tension in my body felt coiled and ready to snap. My eyesight seemed to blur at the edges. I went to a mirror, half dreading what I might see. My reflection stared back, matching my every exhausted move, eyes bloodshot but undeniably my own. That was weeks ago. Since then, I've boarded up the attic door with planks and nailed them in place, layering them with heavy insulation and sealing every gap. Some nights I still hear faint scratching up there, like fingernails running across wood, or maybe just my imagination fueling leftover paranoia. My pulse still speeds up whenever I recall the swirl of shadows or the echo of footsteps in abandoned hallways. I've done everything in my power to prevent that door from reopening. The changes in my home have stopped for now, but every so often I notice a tiny shift. A photo angled differently, a light bulb that seems replaced, and my stomach twists in cold anxiety. There are moments I question if this place truly is the original. My reflection looks right enough. My memories mostly align, and my friends treat me as though everything's normal. But sometimes when I stand in the hallway at night, I feel an oppressive presence, a hint of stale air drifting from the attic, suggesting that maybe there's still a crack in my reality. My heart will pound and my throat will tighten, as if warning me not to investigate so far. I haven't dared pry the boards free to look because after what I've seen, I'm not sure I could handle finding out. I'm yet again in the wrong version of my house. Yet the thought lingers like an itch in the back of my mind. What if this is not my home, but merely the closest approximation? What if the real place lies across that dimension? I glimpse sealed off behind swirling darkness. Sometimes I feel compelled to smash those boards open and search for a final truth, but fear keeps me rooted in indecision. My heart races at the mere notion of climbing that creaking ladder once more. Maybe this is my home, maybe it isn't. All I know is that the attic remains up there, silent and watching, harboring that dimensional passage with infinite variations of my life, and I can never be sure when I wake in the morning and place my feet on the floor if the ground beneath me belongs to the world where I truly began. Story 6. I remember the moment my flashlight's beam first cut through the murk of the forest, like a surgical tool revealing only half-truths and twisted shadows. The air clung to me as though it were alive, pressing against my clothes, cold and stale. Something in the silence felt off, like an unheard melody just out of tune. Even the distant hoot of an owl made my spine tingle instead of comforting me. I had come here for a photography expedition, eager to capture the wild beauty of this place. But the forest greeted me with a hush that promised more than just stillness. It felt as if the trees were standing sentry to secrets far older than I could imagine. And when I took my first photograph, I realized I was capturing something deeper than the forest canopy. I was stepping unknowingly into a domain where nature looked back. I was alone with my camera, an experienced photographer seeking new challenges. But the deeper I ventured, the less certain I became of my own purpose. My heart would jolt at the crunch of leaves underfoot, every tiny sound magnified by the suffocating hush. My breath turned shallow whenever the wind picked up shifting branches like long bony fingers. Overhead, I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing more than the typical anxiety of a person traveling alone through dense wilderness. But a prickling sensation along my forearms told me I was under observation, or worse, under judgment. That night, I made my first camp near a small clearing. The ground was soft with decaying pine needles, and the air smelled of sap and damp earth. I tried to settle my gear, the repeated click and snap of buckles and straps echoing out of place. An uneasy tension settled in my stomach, my pulse accelerated at the slightest noise, and my mind latched onto fleeting shapes that turned out to be mere illusions. Yet even illusions carried a weight that refused to disperse. I recall waking in the middle of the night, the darkness so complete I nearly forgot I had eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs and sweat slicked my temples. Despite the cold silence, reigned no wind, no insects, nothing. It was as though the entire forest held its breath. I blinked in confusion, feeling as though a presence watched me from the edge of my campsite. Something primal within me screamed that I was not alone. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it slipped from my sweaty grip, bouncing on the ground with a dull thud by the time I retrieved it and shone it around. Nothing was there, only the constant press of silent trees and a swirl of fog that licked the earth like a slow, wavering tongue. The next morning I ventured deeper, determined not to let fear dictate my exploration. I trudged through thick undergrowth, each step accompanied by the steady crunch of debris beneath my boots. The longer I hiked, the more I noticed patches of vegetation bending in odd ways. Moss and vines seemed to stretch across paths as though intentionally hindering my progress. My throat felt perpetually dry. I tried to rationalize it. This forest was just unfamiliar, I was just overthinking. But rationality frayed around the edges when I found massive footprints, a shape that might belong to a bear, but larger than I had ever seen. The prints were fresh, the damp soil still springy at the edges. My heart pounded. I felt a stinging sensation behind my eyes. The onset of panic I desperately tried to suppress. I assured myself that wild animals were part of nature as long as I maintained distance and respect. I would be safe. Still, my hands shook when I tried to photograph the tracks, my breath rasped in my throat, and I realized I'd been holding it in short bursts no matter how many times I convinced myself of my safety. A creeping dread coiled in my stomach later that evening as the sun slid behind twisted boughs. I saw it large and imposing. A bear stood on the crest of a low slope about 20 feet away. Its fur was dark, its posture unnaturally still. My blood seemed to freeze in my veins. I wanted to run, but every muscle in my body tensed to the point of paralysis. I locked eyes with the beast in that moment. I felt a presence in my mind, not a sound, but a sensation, a pressure. My breathing turned shallow, my lips trembled, but I perceived a voice, or rather a thought, communicating that I had wandered into a sacred place. My heart thundered with a mix of awe and terror. I heard in my head that this bear was more than just an animal, that it was the spirit guardian of these ancient woods. It showed me glimpses, flashes of possible futures where the forest thrived under human respect or fell to ruin under greed. My skin erupted in goosebumps, a chill raking across my entire body. The bear's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and I could barely keep myself steady. I thought I would faint. The idea that a creature stood before me, speaking through thought, made me question whether I was truly awake. It didn't attack me. It simply observed those next few moments felt like hours. My chest burned from labored breathing, and I could taste adrenaline on my tongue, metallic and bitter. I remember my hands shaking so violently that I dropped my camera. I felt the edges of my vision blur as my heart thundered when I blinked. The bear was gone. A sudden emptiness gnawed at me as though that presence had receded too quickly, leaving me with a raw sense of loss and an undercurrent of dread. For the rest of that night, I could barely sleep. My sweat-drenched clothes clung to me, and each snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I knew the forest didn't feel still anymore. It felt alive and watchful. My mind wouldn't let go of the visions, trees towering over cityscapes, animals reclaiming fields turned barren, and a swirling sense of cosmic retribution. I trembled under my thin sleeping bag, muscles locked, from tension. By the time morning light bled through the canopy, I had convinced myself that what I experienced must have been some feverish nightmare, yet a persistent ache at my temple suggested otherwise. With shaky hands, I gathered my things. Leaves and grass seemed to have grown thicker overnight, curving around my tent as though nature had expanded rapidly. I thought maybe I was just tired, misjudging the density of the vegetation. But as I bent down to roll up my sleeping bag, I noticed green tendrils crawling along my fingertips. The realization struck me like a punch in the gut. The plants were reacting to my touch, growing at an accelerated pace right before my eyes. My eyes felt hot, and my breath caught in my throat as I jerked my hands away. I couldn't believe what was happening when I tentatively touched a small cluster of ferns near the base of a tree. They stretched higher, their leaves unfolding in seconds as though sped up by a time lapse. A jolt of fear shot through my spine. Was this part of the curse or gift the spirit bear had given me? As the day progressed, the unsettling phenomena continued. Small animals emerged from the undergrowth, limping, or wounded squirrels with matted fur approached me. Trembling foxes with cuts on their sides crept closer. My instinct told me to flee, but something in me responded to their silent pleas. I extended my hand without truly understanding why a warmth pulsed from the center of my chest down my arm, and as I touched their injuries, I felt their muscles tense, then relax. Their wounds knitted themselves together in seconds. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and cold sweat pulled at my temples. What sort of influence had I been granted? I decided I needed to leave the forest to escape whatever I had become, but the labyrinth of trees and undergrowth conspired to keep me in my GPS. Malfunctioned the screen. Glitching with static lines, the compass dial spun erratically, pointing in multiple directions. At once, my water supply ran low, and each step felt heavier than the last. The forest air seemed to pulse with an almost sentient awareness. I began to suspect that my presence was no longer that of a mere explorer. I was part of something bigger, a vessel carrying a dangerous and miraculous power. Whether it was a blessing or a curse, I felt unworthy and terrified. In the afternoons, the sky would darken prematurely, the sun swallowed by looming clouds. The wind picked up with gusts that sounded like distant wails. My anxiety intensified. Occasionally, I sensed the bear's presence, though it remained unseen. A rustle in the leaves, a low vibration coursing through the ground. These were signs that it was near, and each time my arms would break into goosebumps and a cold wave of dread would wash over my body. My throat dried up, making it difficult to swallow. I could almost hear the creature's thoughts reminding me of the visions it had shown, urging me to act responsibly with this new power. But the words, if they could be called words, were cloaked in warning. It was as if the guardian expected me to fulfill a duty I never agreed to. I grew more paranoid with each passing hour. Every rustling bush, every cracked twig made my heart lurch. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched. I found myself spinning around in circles, shining my flashlight at nothing. The sweat on my palms made me drop my map repeatedly, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. My breathing grew ragged, and the forest floor seemed to undulate beneath my feet, as though the earth itself was shifting to trip me up. Time lost meaning in that oppressive gloom. Days and nights blurred together in an endless cycle of anxiety. I started to hallucinate silhouettes at the corner of my eye, tall shadows that disappeared when I turned to face them. strange shapes scuttling just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. My heart never stopped its frantic pounding, my gut in a constant state of churn. I questioned my own sanity. Maybe the telepathic bear, the accelerated growth, the healing power. Maybe it was all a delusion triggered by isolation, yet the evidence of my strange abilities persisted. I couldn't deny what was happening in front of me. Every time I touched a sapling, it stretched and sprouted new branches. The wounded fauna approached with trust, leaving healthy and whole, and with each new act of unintentional healing, I felt a deeper bond to this place. It was as if vines were weaving around my very essence, binding me to the forest's fate. Late one evening, desperate and on the verge of complete mental collapse, I stumbled into a ravine. The rocky walls loomed on either side, making me feel trapped. Fog clung to the ground like a living entity. My lungs burned from exertion, and my heart felt like it might burst at any moment. A sense of doom crawled along my spine. I heard the rustle of movement on the ridge above my chest. Seized up with immediate fear, and my pulse quickened to the point of pain, light faint but unmistakable glimmered through the fog. It revealed the massive silhouette of the bear, once again perched on a rock outcropping. My body shook uncontrollably. The presence bloomed in my mind, more forceful than before. It conveyed in a rush of images that I stood at the threshold of choice. I felt its message continue deeper into the labyrinth and assume the role of caretaker or return to human civilization with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. My entire frame trembled as I weighed the impossible decision. I sensed the forest pressing in on all sides, a living witness to my every heartbeat. Sweat dribbled down my forehead, stinging my eyes. My lips quivered and I felt my stomach knot with an urgent desire to escape. Yet something compelled me to approach the massive shape. Each step echoed in the narrow ravine and my breath came in ragged bursts. The world teetered between suffocating darkness and the faint luminescence of the bear's presence. My mind filled with contradictory impulses, fear, fascination, revulsion, reverence. Then without warning, the bear vanished, leaving only a faint impression of its outline in the fog. The air felt thinner as though a huge weight had been lifted, but the memory of its presence remained seared into my consciousness. My stomach churned and my thoughts reeled as I tried to process what had happened in that final moment. The bear's voice or thought had insisted I remember the possibilities it had shown me. It wanted me to carry that burden, to decide what would become of these woods. I sank to my knees in the damp soil, gasping for air that refused to fully fill my lungs. After regaining some composure, I clutched at the rock wall and climbed out of the ravine. My limbs felt like lead and every muscle in my body ached, yet I pressed on, guided by a fleeting hope that I might find the edge of this haunted sanctuary. Hour after grueling hour, I navigated tangled thickets and overgrown trails. My heart thumped with the fear that the forest might never release me, but eventually the trees thinned. Weak sunlight filtered through a break in the canopy. My legs quivered when I stumbled onto a dirt road. The first sign of humanity I had seen in days. Relief and dread battled inside me. The realization slamming into my chest that although I had escaped the suffocating clutches of the forest, I carried something of it with me now. My clothes were torn and covered in moss. My skin was etched with tiny scratches, and a disturbing sense of empowerment lingered in my veins when I finally reached a small outpost. I noticed that wildflowers sprang up where I placed my hands on the ground. The images of that towering bear, the telepathic warnings, and the future visions refused to leave my mind, even when surrounded by the relative normalcy of people. My heart still raced as if anticipating something ominous in the coming weeks. Animals with injuries somehow found their way to me. No matter where I went, my fingertips still carried that strange heat, compelling me to heal, and every night I drifted into uneasy sleep, haunted by the forest's silent vow I am forever changed. My nightmares are laced with the guardian's unblinking stare, with vines tangling around my wrists, pulling me back into the humid darkness. I feel the earth's pulse beneath my feet, a burden and a gift that will never leave me and always just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I sense that old spirit's presence. Perhaps the forest chose me, or maybe it doomed me. Either way, I can't escape the hum of hidden magic coursing through my blood. That suffocating hush has followed me into my everyday life, a persistent, voiceless reminder that I have been bound to something far greater and far more terrifying than I ever wanted to know. Story 7, I could feel the dread the moment I stepped into the office that evening, an almost chemical thickness in the air that clung to my skin and made my lungs hesitate. The overhead lights buzzed quietly, casting awkward shadows on the walls, shapes that felt strangely out of place. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why I felt so uneasy, but every instinct told me I should turn around and leave. Instead, I pressed on, drawn by a terrible curiosity that gnawed at the back of my mind, the kind that refuses to let you look away from whatever lurks in the darkness. I'm not sure when the first suspicion crept into my life. Maybe it was the odd symbols that appeared under a specific kind of blue-tinted light. Or perhaps it was the way my business partner's voice dropped into a hushed, almost reverent tone whenever the topic of our company's meteoric rise came up, but it all came crashing down. When I discovered the black folder, the folder was tucked away in a locked drawer in my partner's private office. That night, I had stayed late to finalize some budget reports. We were working on a massive expansion that would triple our income within a year or so. We believed while searching for a specific contract, I stumbled upon that hidden drawer. The lock was flimsy and curiosity overpowered any sense of decorum inside. I found a stack of documents with an unusual watermark barely visible under normal light, but as I held a phone flashlight against it, I saw twisting lines and symbols that formed something akin to a crest. My stomach churned. I could almost feel those symbols pulsing beneath my fingertips as though the paper itself were alive for days. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, some peculiar custom design, but I kept remembering how our clients sometimes flinched when they glanced at those watermarks. I started paying more attention. Soon I noticed the contracts had small scribbled footnotes in a language that was neither English nor anything else I recognized. When I showed them to a friend who was once a language major, he only gave me a confused stare and said it wasn't even remotely similar to any known script curiosity turned into obsession. Late at night, I combed through old business records in our digital archives trying to find a clue about who had drawn up these deals. I found references to a benefactor whose name never appeared in full, only as the letter D attached to confidential instructions. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together bits of cryptic information. The success of our company wasn't just due to our marketing campaigns and strategic partnerships. There was something else at work, something older, malevolent, a force that demanded more than just a signature. I confronted my partner indirectly. Choosing my words carefully, I hinted that I knew about some strange terms in our contracts. He brushed it off with a nervous chuckle, looking as though he had been caught with something far worse than a simple oversight. I didn't press him that day. However, I later overheard him in a tense phone conversation. His tone suggested the other person on the line held an undeniable power over him. I caught a few phrases, the gist being that there was a due date approaching and there would be consequences for tardiness. My partner sounded terrified, apologetic, and oddly resigned. The first real sign that something was horribly wrong came during a photo shoot for a new marketing campaign. One of our photographers showed me a series of images he had snapped in the boardroom. At first glance, everything looked normal, just me and my partner in our suits forced smiles. But behind us in the reflection of the glass wall, there were dark silhouettes, not silhouettes of people standing behind us. These shapes were elongated, twisted, and they lacked any semblance of a human outline. Their heads were misshapen, their limbs too long, too spindly worse. Yet these forms seemed to be leaning in as if eavesdropping on our conversation. When I called my partner to look at the photographs, he refused. He stood a few feet away, refusing to make eye contact with me or the images, claiming he was in a hurry. That evening, I studied those pictures alone in my office, heart pounding with every flick of the arrow key on my keyboard. The shapes seemed to move closer as if captured in the mid-approach. I thought I was losing my mind, but no matter how many times I blinked, the shapes were still there. I had the strangest feeling they were watching me. Even through the photograph, the next few days were a blur of anxiety. I wasn't sleeping, could barely eat. I started seeing flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, a black form darting behind a piece of furniture, a faint whisper of something brushing by me in the hallway. My chest felt tight. My breath was shallow and beads of sweat gathered at my temples. Whenever I had to review more contracts, I was convinced the symbols on those pages were shifting under the light, rearranging themselves into new shapes. Whenever I looked away, my partner, meanwhile, had grown more distant. He avoided me at every opportunity, deflecting any questions with one-word answers delivered through clenched teeth. One particularly long night, I dreamt of that watermark. It morphed into a gaping mem with rows of impossibly sharp teeth. In the dream, the paper itself wrapped around my arms, pulling me into that black mouth. I woke up gasping for air, my heart thudding like it was about to tear out of my chest. My hands shook and I realized I was gripping my bedsheet so tightly that my nails had left half-moon indentations on my palms. I decided enough was enough. I confronted my partner. I demanded an explanation, told him I couldn't go on pretending everything was fine. He finally confessed haltingly that he had made a deal, signed a contract with an entity that guaranteed our rapid success. I could see the panic in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. He mentioned an arrangement that was supposed to be simple money in exchange for the entity's support. But as the years passed, the terms twisted. My partner admitted he hadn't read the fine print carefully. Apparently, it wasn't just money. The entity demanded there was something intangible, some essence it wished to collect. He revealed that the deadline for payment was imminent. The shadows we saw, the symbols. Even the ominous presence in the photographs were all signs that the entity was growing impatient. My partner spoke in clipped, desperate phrases as though each sentence cost him. Physically, he said, we couldn't fight it in any ordinary sense. The only way to appease this force was to renegotiate to offer more, but the entity now wanted something far more valuable than money. My partner wouldn't specify what the possibility chilled my blood. I found myself unable to stay in the office after sunset. The building felt alive with unseen watchers. Corners of corridors seemed to pulse with quiet malevolence. The fluorescent lights in the corridors flickered at random intervals, drenching the walls in a sickly green hue. Every time I passed a reflective surface, glass doors, windows, polished tables, I caught glimpses of those unnatural forms. Once in the reflection of the large display window near the lobby, I saw what looked like a pair of eyes, glowing faintly red, hovering in the background. When I whipped around, there was no one there, just the thick silence of an empty foyer and my own ragged breathing at home. I was plagued by insomnia. My heart would start racing out of nowhere, a dizzying rush of adrenaline for no discernible reason. Paranoia set in. I scanned every shadow in my bedroom, convinced something was crouched behind the dresser or lurking under the bed. My partner called me late one night. His voice trembling, he said he'd encountered a physical manifestation of the entity in the elevator. He described it as a tall figure draped in black with a face he couldn't fully see. It spoke without moving its lips, an intrusive voice in his head that demanded immediate payment. My partner had stammered that he needed more time, and then the elevator doors opened onto a floor that didn't exist in our building's layout. He stepped out to find himself in a hallway with no windows, no exit signs, only pulsating lights in the ceiling. Eventually, the elevator slid open again behind him and he stumbled back in. Returning to reality, if one could call it that, I felt a sharp sting in my chest. Just picturing this scenario, my breathing went shallow and my limbs felt cold. I realized there was no simple way out. We were in too deep. The next day, I met with my partner in the boardroom in broad daylight. I refused to go at night. My partner explained that the entity had given him a final deadline, midnight 3 days away. If we failed to provide the additional payment, the cost would be unimaginable. The walls of the boardroom suddenly seemed too close, the air too thin. I could smell the stale coffee in the corner, the bitterness clashing with my mounting sense of dread. He told me he had a plan, a last-ditch effort to negotiate with the entity. He had discovered an obscure ritual that might grant us an audience under controlled terms. I thought he was losing his mind. But then again, so was I. The incessant shadows, The monstrous silhouettes, the sense of being watched by something well beyond human comprehension, they were all too real. Night fell far too quickly on the day of the ritual. My partner and I stayed in the office waiting for the stroke of midnight. The fluorescent lamps above us buzzed like angry insects, casting our jittery shadows on the floor. I couldn't stop wiping the sweat off my brow. My throat so dry it felt like sandpaper. Finally, we turned off all the lights, leaving only a single table lamp draped with a red-tinted cloth to create a dim glow. My partner began reciting words that made my skin crawl. Words that sounded wrong in my ears, as if no human mouth should ever produce them. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath forming clouds in the darkness. Then I felt it, a presence heavy and suffocating. The air thickened and the lamp started flickering. I forced my eyes to the corner of the boardroom where the shadows congealed into a form. A slender, towering silhouette with joint angles that seemed broken, twisted. I couldn't see a face, only a blackness that seemed to devour the light. My partner's voice faltered and he let out a choked gasp. I didn't dare move. My teeth were practically chattering from both cold and terror. I heard a voice in my head, cold, commanding, ancient. It stated that the payment due was no longer monetary, that something much more precious was required. My heart thundered against my ribcage and my entire body quaked as if some terrible force was passing through me. I could sense the entity's impatience, a primal hunger radiating from it. My partner stammered an offer. He tried to bargain to buy more time. The presence seemed to laugh silently, an unearthly vibration that made every hair on my body stand on end. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I would lose consciousness. Then a wave of dread crashed over me as the entity's attention shifted to me. I tasted bile rising in my throat. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt nailed to the floor. The entity demanded something deeper than wealth or property, something intangible that struck at the core of who we were. For a fleeting moment, I saw a swirl of images in my mind's eye, my memories, my ambitions, my sense of self, all laid out. Like currency on a demonic marketplace, the entity threatened that if we failed to comply, it would claim what it was owed in ways we couldn't fathom. My partner tried to shout that we'd do anything to prevent that, but the presence vanished, leaving a crushing silence. We never completed the ritual. We didn't have to. The deadline was set the next day. We both refused to set foot in the office. The place had become a prison of nightmares. We holed up in a nearby hotel, sleeping with the lights on our suitcases. Half packed in case we needed to flee at a moment's notice, my mind raced with irrational solutions. Could we leave the country, burn, the contracts disappear? Yet that voice in my head insisted there was nowhere to hide from a force that transcended any physical boundary. Midnight came again, and I felt the entity's pull like gravity. My partner seemed to reach some breaking point with shaking hands. He burned all the demonic contracts he had in his possession. Thick black smoke rose from the flames, and for a second I thought I saw a face in the billowing smoke leering at us with eyes that glowed like embers. My vision blurred with tears from the acrid smell. We coughed and stumbled back. Terrified, by the time the flames died, the documents were reduced to a fine ash that clung to every surface. I tried to steady my breathing, wondering if this act had helped or only worsened our situation. The lights in the room flickered, and for an agonizing minute, everything was plunged into pitch-black darkness. When the lights came back on, I realized the shadows were gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted at least partially in the days that followed. I felt a lingering sense of unease, as if something was still watching from just outside my field of vision. My partner wouldn't speak about the incident anymore, except to say that we should never mention it again. We both resigned from the company, leaving the once promising empire to fend for itself. Without our leadership, we parted ways without fanfare, each too consumed by private horrors to maintain any semblance of friendship. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the contract remains in effect, that the entity is still out there waiting for a loophole to drag us back into its orbit. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I hear faint whispers in a language I don't understand. My heart pounds like a frantic drum, and I feel that same old terror coursing through my veins. Even now, as I write this, the overhead light in my study flickers just once. The air grows uncomfortably cold, and I find myself shivering despite the warmth of the room. I can't help but wonder if I truly escaped, or if sooner or later the entity will come to collect what it believes is rightfully owed. The thought leaves my mouth dry and my pulse hammering in my ears, and despite all logic, I can't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark silhouette stretched across the wall, looming in patient silence. Story 8, I still remember the first sign that something was deeply wrong. The silence felt too thick, too suffocating, as if I were entombed in the train car rather than merely seated in it. The fluorescent ceiling lights hummed in a low pulsing drone that my ears couldn't escape. My skin prickled under layers of stale air, and every muscle in my body tensed, preparing for a threat I couldn't define. It was that primal sense, the one that triggers. When you realize there's a predator in the darkness, I recall blinking in slow motion at my own reflection in the window, noticing how the outside world was nothing more than a shapeless black void, as if our tracks led nowhere but deeper into the unknown. I had boarded this overnight train from a small station on the outskirts of a city I was just passing through for a work trip. It had been an unremarkable evening, just a typical business travel day with the usual stiff seat and half-empty carriage. I had told myself to catch a few hours of sleep, but rest never came. My mind drifted in a strange half state of wakefulness and anxious anticipation, like I was waiting for the slightest shift to confirm that I should be afraid. I heard the gentle rattle of the wheels on the tracks, the squeaking of the overhead luggage racks, and the muffled coughs of the few other travelers who were still awake. At some point, I felt the train slow down. My immediate thought was that it was too soon to arrive anywhere. The lights flickered once, then steadied. My stomach did a little flip as the train lurched to a stop. Curiosity won over fatigue, so I stood and peered out the window. The station platform was dimly lit by erratic bulbs that buzzed in and out of brightness, casting sickly yellow patterns on the ground. The sign that hung overhead was impossible to read. The letters looked smeared or twisted, as though the paint had melted in the sun, even from inside the carriage. The air felt colder, and the smell that drifted in was pungent, like stagnant water mixed with ash. My pulse quickened. I took out my phone to check my map app, but there was no recorded station in this area. The train had apparently pulled into a place that, according to every piece of technology I owned, simply did not exist. A chill snaked its way up my spine. I found myself swallowing hard, an inexplicable dryness invading my mouth. I told myself the network coverage might just be spotty, or that the station could be brand new and not yet updated on the maps deep down, though an unmistakable fear sank its teeth into my thoughts. I noticed other passengers around me growing alert too, but few seemed eager to step onto the platform through the windows. I watched as figures began to board. They moved in stiff, synchronized motions, and their faces were cast in half shadow. Their skin seemed pale, no more like gray, with a dull, lifeless hue. They glided past me, taking seats in various corners of the carriage. My heart was hammering in my chest by then, and I could feel a thread of cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I tried to assure myself it was just the eerie lighting or my own imagination playing tricks. Still, the way those new passengers settled into their seats with vacant stares and unnerving stillness made every hair on my arm stand on end when the train started moving again. The usual rocking felt oddly different. It was too smooth, almost as if the rails beneath us had disappeared and we were sliding along an invisible track. The conductor made an announcement over the intercom, but the words were garbled. Distant, I thought I heard mention of a schedule adjustment and unexpected stops, but the static swallowed the rest. The conductor's voice was calm, almost cheerful, but in a hollow way that turned my veins to ice. Looking out the window, I expected to see the countryside, or at least the faint glow of a distant town. Instead, the landscape appeared as shifting silhouettes, a patchwork of shapes that defied logic. Sometimes I thought I saw enormous leafless trees bending impossibly toward the train. Other times I glimpsed glimpses of weirdly angled rock formations looming against a horizon lit by a pulsing sky. It didn't look like night-day or any recognizable transition between the two. It was as if we were passing through a world that existed outside normal rules. I tried to quell the rising panic by telling myself I must be dreaming, that I had dozed off and fallen into a particularly vivid nightmare. My body told a different story. My heart pounded so intensely it felt like my ribcage might crack, and a sheen of cold sweat clung to my forehead. My breath grew shallow as though the air itself had thickened. Somewhere ahead, I saw the conductor emerging from a doorway. He passed by the newly boarded passengers, first speaking to them in hushed, clipped tones I couldn't fully decipher. Then he approached me, his expression unnervingly blank. He wore the standard uniform, but it was slightly discolored. The jacket faded to a greenish gray, as though it had once been navy but had drained of color over time. He addressed me in a low voice, suggesting, though not outright stating, that we would be making a sequence of unscheduled stops, and that I should remain in my seat when I asked him if everything was all right. He responded with an odd half smile. It wasn't comforting. It was more like a reflex. His eyes, however, told me everything was far from normal. He seemed amused by my question, as though my fear was inconsequential or worse yet. Expected, I pressed for more information, but he just shook his head and repeated that we were continuing with our journey. A sense of dread swelled in my chest. I couldn't force the words out of my dry throat to question him further, so I nodded mutely and let him move on over the next hour, or what I assumed was an hour, since time began to feel malleable. I watched the train screech to a halt at station after station. Each stop had its own twisted architecture. One was shadowed by towering angular structures that resembled rows of broken teeth. Another glowed with a sickly violet light, its platform strewn with an oily substance that reflected swirling colors as though it was alive at each station. More passengers with that same lifeless gaze climbed aboard, wordlessly taking seats without so much as blinking in my direction. I began to notice that some of the original passengers from earlier in the night no longer seemed present when I toured the aisles. With my eyes, I could not see certain individuals I had clearly observed before there was no sign of them. I recalled a man with a heavy winter coat, a woman with a floral scarf. They were just gone. My pulse hammered at my temples and I swallowed hard, a trickle of perspiration sliding down my temple. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was clutching the edge of my seat with trembling fingers, knuckles turning. White in desperation, I summoned the courage to speak to a fellow traveler. He was a middle-aged man sitting 2 rows behind me, someone I had earlier seen reading a paperback novel. I tried to ask if he had noticed the disappearing passengers, or if he had an explanation for these impossible stations. He answered me indirectly, his voice shaky. He said he had noticed people vanishing too, and that each time we stopped, he felt something tugging at the back of his mind, a pull toward the platform that he struggled to resist. He muttered more to himself than to me that the train was looking for suitable replacements. His words echoed in my head, suitable replacements. A hot surge of panic spread through my chest and my breathing became more ragged. I could hardly keep my thoughts organized. My body felt as if it were betraying me. Every nerve jittered. Every muscle twitched as though I was on the verge of sprinting away from some predator. My vision seemed to tunnel, and for a moment I was afraid I might pass out. Yet something kept me alert, a primal survival instinct urging me to stay conscious. Soon the conductor returned, weaving through the silent, impassive passengers and stopping beside me. He spoke calmly, mentioning that the journey had a unique requirement. The train only ceased its loop when it encountered a traveler who could take on an eternal passage. In other words, this train of the damned needed a fresh soul willing or unwilling to bear its curse. As he spoke, there was a flicker in his gaze that suggested he'd been through this routine countless times. He seemed to imply that many of the passengers seated around us had once been like me, alert, afraid, desperate for answers. Now they were husks, abiding by some eternal contract. I wanted to protest, to shout that I would never accept such a fate, but my voice came out as a rasp, my mouth too dry to form a proper objection. I saw no pity in the conductor's expression, only inevitability. He left me there drifting deeper into my seat. heart thudding so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The next stop was somehow darker than the others, a place veiled in swirling mist that crept through the open doors and licked at our feet. The train's lights flickered madly, painting the new arrivals in strobe-like flashes. Their eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, and I swear their irises were milky white, ringed with a faint luminescence. A wave of nausea twisted my stomach, and I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to keep from retching my muscles. Tensed as if preparing for flight, but I forced myself to remain still. Fear tangling with the irrational sense that if I moved I would draw their attention, I decided then that I had to attempt escape. Staying on this endless route of horrors felt like a slow descent into some kind of living nightmare from which I might never emerge. The idea that these vacant-eyed strangers had once been normal travelers like me set every nerve on fire. I felt a prickling at the back of my scalp as I realized that if I didn't act, I might become as gray and void of life as they were in the small corridor between cars. I discovered an emergency lever usually meant to stop the train in dire situations. My fingers shook violently as I reached for it. The cold metal biting into my palm, I yanked it down with all the strength I could muster, expecting the screech of brakes, or at least some mechanical jolt. Instead, the train barely shuddered. It slowed only a fraction before continuing on its relentless course. A hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from my chest, but I choked it back. My last shred of control felt tenuous at best. Still, the labor's effect must have signaled something. The conductor appeared yet again, his eyes drilling into me. Accompanied by two of those pallet passengers, I recall feeling a wave of dizziness and an urge to collapse. The conductor spoke in a stern, quiet tone, warning me that there was no escape, that the train only stopped for stations it chose. I felt my heart skip a beat, but I stared back at him, determined not to surrender to panic as I slid back into my seat. I forced myself to think of any possible exit. Windows seemed sealed shut. The doors locked firmly, but there had to be a moment. Maybe when the doors opened at the next station where I could slip off the train. I prepared myself by gripping the armrest so hard my fingers ached. My shoulders stiffened under the tension and a sharp pain shot through my neck. Sweat dripped down my temples and my mouth felt like sandpaper. My vision tunneled again, but I held tight to a single idea: I had to get out. When the train screeched to its next stop, I watched carefully as the automatic doors opened. A thick swirling fog clung to the platform. The lights outside buzzed in odd frequencies, flickering in time with the frantic hammering of my heart. Shadows in the mist writhed like living things, contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. The new passengers stepped on board in a slow, unnatural rhythm, their eyes once again that same ashen glare. I counted to 3 under my breath on the third beat. Adrenaline surged through me. I leaped from my seat, lunged past two of the gray-skinned travelers, and threw myself out the door. My boots hit the platform with a jarring thud that sent vibrations rippling up my legs. My knees almost buckled from the impact, but I managed to stay upright. Panic seized me in an iron grip, urging me to run. The platform felt strangely rubbery beneath my feet, as though it was an entirely solid mist coiled around my ankles, making every step uncertain. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw those unsettling passengers standing at the threshold. Their gazes bore into me, but they didn't give chase. I didn't wait to find out if they would. I sprinted, ignoring the wild pounding in my chest and the searing burn in my lungs. The fog thickened until I could barely see more than a foot in front of me. The echo of my own footsteps bounced around as if the platform were an enclosed chamber rather than an open space. The darkness pressed in and a wave of dizziness washed over me. Suddenly, the ground beneath me vanished and I felt weightless for a split second, as if I were falling off the edge of the world. But then there was light. A warm, artificial glow, and I found myself stumbling onto familiar concrete flooring. The noise of a normal city station filled my ears, the metallic screech of a different train's brakes, the murmur of unsuspecting travelers. I breathed hard, nearly collapsing onto a nearby bench. My entire body trembled, drenched in sweat, my heart threatening to break through my ribs. I looked around wildly, expecting grayish passengers to burst through the swirling air behind me. Instead, I saw a very ordinary terminal complete with fluorescent lights, vending machines, and people hurrying about their business. My mouth hung open in disbelief. A station worker approached asking if I needed medical assistance. I couldn't even form proper words, so I simply shook my head. Heart still racing like a wild animal trying to escape a snare in the hours or days or minutes. I truly couldn't tell. Afterward, I made my way to a nearby cafe where I gulped down water and tried to steady my nerves. I patted my pockets to see if I still had my phone, my wallet, anything to remind me that I was real. They were all there undisturbed, as if none of it had happened yet. The memory of that impossible journey clung to me with an iron grip. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the colorless faces staring back, the impossible landscapes flowing by outside the windows, the silent stations that existed in no map or timetable. I still cannot fully explain what I went through or why I was allowed to step off the train. Part of me wonders if in my frantic scramble I failed to notice an invisible contract snapping shut around someone else, or maybe I simply wasn't the right candidate. The more I think about it, the more I sense there was an intelligence guiding the train, orchestrating each stop in search of exactly the person it needed. Perhaps it found that person, or perhaps it's still circling, waiting. Even now, I feel the hush of that train in my nightmares, luring me into half-waking states. My body always reacts the same way my heart rate triples. Sweat beads on my forehead and the muscles in my arms and legs tense until they cramp when my eyes snap open. I can still taste that stagnant ashen air. A single question haunts me, echoing in the recesses of my mind. If that train comes for me again, will I have the strength or the luck to escape once more? I have no intention of traveling by night train ever again, but a gnawing dread reminds me that it may not matter. There's a sense that the train exists outside simple constraints like schedule or geography. It can appear wherever and whenever it chooses, sliding between realities on quiet evenings. I swear I can hear a distant whistle that calls my name, beckoning me to resume a voyage. I narrowly escaped, and each time my blood runs cold, my breath hitches, and I'm seized by a new wave of paranoia, convinced that somewhere a conductor is waiting. Arms folded, eyes hollow, ready to guide me back onto that eternal railway story 9. I remember the first time I felt genuine dread crawling under my skin like a cold, living thing. It was one of those nights when every shadow felt too long and every sound hung in the air, unresolved. I'd just gotten home from the most uncomfortable first date I'd ever had, an awkward dinner that began with false smiles and ended in a tense, wordless ride back to my place. I thought the worst part of the evening was the date itself, but I was wrong. The real terror began when I checked my phone and realized there was a message from myself. At first, I thought it must be some bizarre glitch. My dating app notification showed a message from a profile picture that was undeniably mine, yet I had no memory of creating any additional account. With a tightness in my chest and a growing sense of unease, I opened the conversation. The text said something eerily mundane, like a greeting. Only it addressed me by a pet name I'd never shared with anyone. It was something I had only thought of in fleeting moments. A private joke in my own mind. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my heart hammering as if it were trying to beat its way out of my rib cage. All the tension from the earlier date immediately drained, replaced by a deeper chill that seeped into my bones. I wanted to believe it was a friend pulling a prank, but I couldn't figure out who could possibly know that secret name. None of my friends had that kind of insight, and I'd never used it online. As I paced around my living room, my eyes darted to the phone screen every few seconds, expecting more messages to appear. The ceiling light above me buzzed with a faint, irritating hum that set my teeth on edge. My fingertips tingled, and I could feel a slow trickle of sweat gathering along the small of my back. The apartment felt silent, too. Silent as though it were waiting for something to happen. I tried to distract myself by fixing a quick snack. The refrigerator's fluorescent light was too bright, and when I grabbed the carton of milk, the handle felt freezing, almost biting into my skin. My mouth was so dry that I could barely swallow. The taste of fear lingered at the back of my throat, even as I poured the milk over a bowl of cereal. My hand shook, causing drops to splatter on the counter. I tried to force the food down, but every bite felt like a struggle. It was only after I put the dish in the sink that I heard my phone vibrate again. A new message. I rushed to it, heart racing, hoping it was just a friend texting, but the dread returned the moment I saw that the sender was the same uncanny profile. My own face stared back at me from a tiny icon, but the expression looked off. My photo had been taken from an angle I didn't recall, and the eyes seemed almost hollow. I felt a spike of panic as I opened the message. This time it referenced a regret from my past, a humiliating mistake I'd never spoken about to anyone. My stomach twisted. How was it possible that this phantom account knew such personal information? I remembered the sour taste in my mouth as I tried to calm myself by turning on some background noise. I flicked on the TV, but the screen froze, refusing to show anything but static. Every time I pressed a button, the remote seemed unresponsive. The static grew louder, distorted, as if hissing directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt my breath hitch as the lights in my apartment flickered. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder that static seemed to get, building a suffocating tension in the room. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the furniture made my body tense. Every whisper of air through the vents felt threatening. I lay there on my bed covers pulled up to my chest, eyes glued to the phone resting on my nightstand. I could see the faint glow of the screen whenever it lit up with a notification. Once or twice I reached for it only to find no new messages. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted off, my body trembling with the last remnants of adrenaline. The next morning I woke to discover something that made my blood run cold. Photos of me sleeping. They appeared in my phone's gallery as if someone had snapped them in the dead of night. Each image was more horrifying than the last. My curtains were shut, my door locked, yet the pictures were taken from impossible angles. One showed me from directly above my face, contorted in fitful slumber, sweat beads dotting my forehead. Another showed a close-up of my half-open mouth, and I felt violated. To an extent I never thought possible. I couldn't recall hearing the shutter sound or seeing the flash. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst. I immediately checked every corner of my room. The windows were still locked from the inside, and the door chain was in place. My closet stood half open, revealing nothing but clothes and boxes. There was no indication that anyone had broken in my phone. Remained on the nightstand exactly where I'd left it. Still, the pictures were there, and I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I felt my throat close up and my palms began to sweat. My mind raced through every scenario. Could it be some advanced hacking technique? But who would go to this extent, and why did this entity seem to know me so intimately? Desperate for a break from the claustrophobic atmosphere of my apartment, I decided to go to work early. Perhaps the bustle of the city would ground me in reality. The hallway outside my door felt unnaturally quiet. My steps echoed in the dim lighting, and the elevator ride down was punctuated by a flickering overhead lamp. I fiddled with my phone, half expecting it to light up with another unholy message. When I reached the lobby, the reception desk was unoccupied. The air was heavy, as if charged with static electricity, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prick up. I hurried out into the street, my heart still. Hammering away work was no relief. My coworkers, noticing my pale complexion, asked if I was ill. I offered a vague response, claiming I had trouble sleeping the entire day. The hum of fluorescent lights and the tap of keyboards seemed amplified, drilling into my head whenever I tried to focus. My mind would slip back to the images on my phone, and I felt an unsettling shiver course through my body. By lunchtime, my shirt was damp with cold sweat. Occasionally, I glanced at my phone. Half terrified it would vibrate again. The first direct confrontation came that afternoon. My phone buzzed, and once more it was a message from that uncanny profile. The text was filled with the intimate details of my life, family anecdotes, regrets, fears. I felt nauseous reading them. It was like someone had peeled away every protective layer I had. My pulse quickened. I felt my muscles tense, especially around my neck and shoulders, as if bracing for an attack. My lungs constricted, making it difficult to breathe in the small privacy of a conference room. I tried to calm down, but the overhead lights were flickering. Just like they had in my apartment, the sense of being watched became so strong that I found myself checking the corners of the ceiling for hidden cameras, feeling cornered. I decided to reply, half hoping I would get some clue about who or what was behind this. I typed a brief message, something like, "Who are you?" My thumb hovered over the send button, the tension of the moment pressing heavily on my chest. When I finally pressed it, I felt a jolt go through my body as if crossing a line of no return. The reply came instantly, as though it had been waiting. It said something to the effect of, "I am you, only better." It wasn't quite that direct, but the words implied an entity that had taken my identity, amplified by something beyond normal comprehension. My breath caught, my stomach churned. I turned off my phone only to have it turn itself back on. Moments later, a message blinked on the screen, a single word that cut deep into my psyche. My innermost fear, the specific phobia I'd never shared with a soul. My head spun and I felt a slow, nauseating roll in my gut. By the time I left work, I was in a daze. The evening sky was a sickly orange, and the streetlights buzzed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. As I walked home, I kept my phone in my pocket, too terrified to look at it. Every so often, I sensed its screen lighting up against my thigh, vibrating like a frantic heartbeat. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every passing car seemed to glare at me with flickering headlights. A feeling of growing paranoia gnawed at my mind. I imagined silhouettes watching me from windows, digital eyes analyzing my every move. Back in my apartment, I felt an immediate wave of unease crash over me. The hallway light was out, leaving everything swayed in a dull half-light. My footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the space had expanded and I was trudging through a tunnel. My apartment door stuck when I tried to open it, and my key jammed in the lock for a moment longer than it should have. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker than ever. I turned on the living room lamp only to have it flicker and cast eerie shadows on the walls. I sat on my couch, my lungs struggling to draw in air. The silence pressed against my ears, so overwhelming it bordered on a roar. I unlocked my phone, determined to rid myself of this terror by confronting it directly. Images filled the screen. Unfamiliar photos of me going about daily tasks, brushing my teeth, sitting at my desk, tying my shoes. Each picture was taken from a bizarre angle, as though from the perspective of someone standing just behind me. My breath hitched, my forehead broke out in fresh sweat. I could smell the sour tang of my own fear in the air. Suddenly, the overhead light exploded in a shower of sparks. Glass shards rained down, and I jumped off the couch with my arms thrown up to shield my face. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might give out. In the darkness, my phone's glow became the only source of light, illuminating the scattered shards on the floor. I sensed a presence around me, like static electricity, raising the hair on my arms. It felt like someone was there, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, a digital specter made manifest. My breathing became ragged and my limbs quivered with adrenaline. I remembered the taste of copper in my mouth, like I'd bitten the inside of my cheek without realizing it. I was dizzy with terror, fighting the urge to scream. Then the phone buzzed in my trembling hand. Another message, instructions telling me to go to the bedroom, describing in detail what I would find there. My rational mind insisted I should just leave, but I felt compelled to follow the directive, as if some part of me needed to know. I navigated the dark hallway with shaking legs, the phone lighting my way. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar. Even though I always kept it closed, a faint odor of stale air leaked out, and I could hear a faint scratching noise, like fingertips across a window pane. Entering felt like stepping into a nightmare. My bed was stripped of blankets, and all my pillows were arranged in a pile on the floor. Across the walls were digital projections, my pictures cycling rapidly like a cursed slideshow, each image flickering across the wall in ghostly illumination. My chest tightened, my breath came in shallow bursts. I could barely think straight, my mind a swirl of disbelief and panic. The slideshow showed images of me at various points in my life, some from years ago, some from mere hours earlier. Each one was accompanied by a flickering strobe effect that made me feel as though I was teetering on the edge of an epileptic fit. Then I caught sight of something that made my blood congeal, a live feed of my own face, contorted with terror. Staring at the phone screen, the camera angle was from the ceiling behind me as if I were being filmed. That very second, I spun around, shining my phone upward, but saw nothing except the bare ceiling. No device, no lens yet. The feed persisted. My mind buckled under the impossibility of it all. My pulse thundered, and I felt faint, like the floor might collapse beneath me. There was a moment when I questioned if I was hallucinating, if my exhaustion and anxiety had finally snapped my grasp on reality. Then something in me rebelled against the fear, as if a primal survival mechanism kicked in. I forced myself to think maybe this thing, this digital entity, was feeding on my terror. I breathed in deeply, ignoring the dryness in my throat, ignoring the stabs of panic in my gut. My hands still shook, but I managed to navigate to my phone settings. If it could manipulate my devices from afar, maybe I needed to isolate it with trembling fingers. I activated airplane mode, then turned off the Wi-Fi router from a switch in the hallway. The flickering projections on the walls faded out, leaving me in near total darkness. I stumbled to the living room, rummaging in a drawer for a flashlight. The place felt oppressive, as though the very walls were pressing in. Even with the phone offline, I felt something intangible swirling around me. My head pounded, my throat was parched, and every breath was a struggle. The thought of leaving the apartment altogether flitted through my mind, but I worried about what might follow me outside. Still, anything felt better than staying locked in that suffocating darkness. Gathering my keys, I made my way to the door. My flashlight's beam shook erratically, bouncing off the walls as I tried to steady my hand. At one point, the beam landed on a mirror, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection. My eyes wide and haunted. I looked like a cornered animal drenched in cold sweat. A flicker of movement in the corner of the mirror made my heart skip, but when I jerked the flashlight over, nothing was there. I managed to step out into the hallway, locking the door behind me. The corridor lights were still dim and flickering. The air felt stale, and I could hear a strange whispering noise like static or a faint radio signal. My pulse refused to slow, and my muscles ached from the constant tension. Yet I forced myself to keep going, to walk away from my apartment and out of that building, one foot in front of the other. The street outside was eerily quiet. For this time of night, the city sounds muffled, as if I'd stepped into a parallel version of my neighborhood. I turned, looking up at my building's dark windows. It felt like the entire structure was watching me, silently mocking me for my futile attempt to run. A distant rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, but no rain fell. The air crackled with electricity, or maybe it was just my frayed nerves. I ended up taking a long walk, weaving through unfamiliar streets. Phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline, even in airplane mode. I kept checking the screen, half expecting to see that unsettling face again. Hours passed without a single new message. My heart rate began to settle, though my stomach remained in knots. Eventually, I found myself at a 24-hour diner, lights buzzing overhead, the linoleum floor giving off a harsh reflection. I slipped into a booth, trying to ignore how my entire body trembled whenever I thought back to the images. My mind questioned everything. Was I losing it? Did any of this truly happen? Yet the memory of that digital feed haunted me, my own face staring back in real time. After some time, I mustered the courage to turn my phone's connectivity back on for several agonizing seconds. Nothing happened. Then one last message arrived from that same phantom profile. It was short, almost cryptic, hinting that it couldn't be banished so easily, that our bond was forged by the darkest recesses of my psyche. My hand clenched around the phone until my knuckles turned white, and I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my temples. A wave of claustrophobic terror swept over me, but I realized I was out in public now, away from the claustrophobic shadows of my apartment. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't flee from it anymore if it was part of me or claimed to be. Then I had to face it head on. The fear still nodded at me, but something about being in that brightly lit diner steadied my nerves. Just enough, I breathed in and out, slow and deliberate, focusing on the faint scent of old coffee and fried food. People around me were absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to my internal horror. For the first time in 2 days, I felt a tiny pinprick of resolve in the pit of my stomach. To this day, I can't say for certain if that entity was supernatural, a manifestation of my anxieties, or some kind of malevolent hacker with impossible technology. All I know is that it still lingers like a presence lurking in every reflection, every piece of digital media I consume. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of my own face angled oddly in a photo I don't remember taking. Sometimes the lights flicker in a pattern that sets my teeth on edge, and once in a while I wake up drenched in sweat. Half convinced I see a silhouette in the corner of my room, yet I press on, determined not to let the terror swallow me whole. I can't pretend everything went back to normal. I still hear static. At odd moments, still worry that at any second my phone will light up with another impossible message. Part of me expects that one day I'll look in the mirror and see that entity standing behind me, smiling with my own stolen face. But until that day comes, if it ever does, I'll cling to the thin thread of hope that maybe, just maybe I'm stronger than my fear, and if it tries to take control again, I will be ready. Even if my heart pounds in my chest like a war drum. Even if cold sweat trickles down my spine, I'll confront it, because what else can I do but stand my ground and refuse to let it devour me from the inside out story? As I felt the chill the moment I stepped into that old theater, a sudden wave of unease that gripped me in the chest and made my breath hitch. The corridor was lined with photographs of past productions. Their colors faded and edges curled, as if even the paper itself were trying to withdraw from some unseen presence. My flashlight flickered unexpectedly, casting jittery shadows on the darkened walls. I couldn't shake the sense that something here was persistently observing me, lurking in corners, peering through the gloom, waiting for its moment to be known. And I had just arrived. My name is Thomas Cruise, and I'm a lighting technician by trade. I came to this historic theater, one I'd admired from a distance since I was a teenager, to help modernize its old electrical system. It had been closed for renovations, then reopened recently for a special series of performances aimed at celebrating its long and storied past. I was excited at first, proud even to contribute to the revival of a place that had housed so many legendary productions. The building had an unmistakable aura of grandeur, with ornate moldings and plush carpeting battered by decades of footsteps. But beneath that beauty lay something else, a pressure in the air, a tension that coiled around my spine. Whenever I stepped inside, as I walked through the backstage area, each footstep echoed against the battered floorboards. My equipment bag felt heavier with every step I took, but I told myself it was only nerves. The smell was a peculiar combination of sawdust rust and something stale like old perfume that had lingered for too long. I tried to focus on the task at hand. Electrical systems were my specialty. I knew how to rewire cables, replace bulbs, and make outdated rigging safe for modern shows. None of that could prepare me for the unearthly occurrences I was about to witness. It started subtly one evening after I'd finished aligning the stage lights and was preparing to leave. I spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a person crossing from stage left to stage. Right at first, I assumed it was a cast member or a stagehand staying late to rehearse or organize costumes. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no rustle of clothing, just silent motion. When I angled my flashlight toward the stage, there was nobody there. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt a dampness on my forehead that was definitely not from the summer heat. A faint hush seemed to drape itself over the entire stage, as if the wooden planks had grown wary of being discovered. My colleagues sometimes mentioned rumors of apparitions, actors from decades past who never truly left. I heard the stories in indirect whispers, a costume designer suggesting that the mirrors in the dressing rooms showed fleeting reflections that vanished when confronted, a caretaker claiming that once in a while he heard lines from old scripts echo under the arches. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that older theaters often come with such legends, but the more time I spent in that building, the more convinced I became that these rumors weren't just folklore. Something was actually happening one night while double-checking the rigging for a complicated lighting setup. I noticed a faint glow on the stage. It looked like a spotlight shining from some old fixture I hadn't installed, curious and a bit wary. I descended from my ladder, crossing carefully to the side of the stage. My mouth went dry as I saw under that pale luminescence a pair of dancers. They wore costumes that seemed lifted from another era, flowing formal outfits with designs I'd only seen in antique photographs. Their movements were slow, methodical, and completely silent. Despite being only a few yards away, I heard no footfalls or breathing, just an ambient hush that weighed on my eardrums. At first, I doubted my own eyes. My chest felt tight, as though I were in the presence of something outside logic. I decided to take a step closer, heart pounding so fiercely that I heard the whoosh of blood in my ears. That single step was enough for them to fade like a reflection in disturbed water. The stage lights flickered, and suddenly I was alone in near darkness. I stood there, gasping, sweat trickling down my back. I wanted to flee the theater right then, but my own curiosity chained me in place. I needed to understand what I had seen and why it felt so real over the ensuing days. More bizarre sightings occurred. I'd catch glimpses of costumed figures rushing to their marks, voices murmuring lines just beyond the edge of audible comprehension. Their attire shifted, sometimes 1920s chic, sometimes 1950s formality. But always from another time, the experiences left me with chills that radiated through my arms and legs. My hands would tremble whenever I found myself alone, and each time the temperature felt as though it plummeted. Eventually, I learned from some old production logs, though no one told me directly, that the theater seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple eras. Certain scenes performed there long ago were trapped in a loop. The actors persisted as apparitions in an endless replay of their final performances. That was the speculation anyway. People avoided speaking of it openly, but the rumors flowed in indirect comments about the building's long list of chronological quirks. Most folks tried to dismiss them as illusions or stress-induced visions, but I couldn't ignore the evidence of my own senses. I reached a breaking point. One evening, when I was adjusting the overhead lights for the upcoming production, I was alone again in the theater, determined to finish my work quickly. As I positioned a spotlight, I caught sight of a shadow flitting across the seats in the auditorium. It was too large to be a single person. I climbed down, ventured into the rows, and noticed an entire scene unfolding. Figures in period costumes seemed to be rehearsing or performing. Their hushed tones were disjointed, reverberating like half-remembered echoes. My throat dried up and my palms grew clammy. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of cold air. Without fully grasping the implications, I impulsively aimed my flashlight at one of the figures. A man wearing a vintage suit at that moment. The figure locked eyes with me, and for a second I felt a surge of energy pierce straight through my core. The lights above flickered violently and I stumbled backward. My hands shook uncontrollably, and a terrifying wave of vertigo nearly knocked me off balance. When I looked back, the seats were empty, but something had changed in me. Later that night in my apartment, an antique pocket watch lay on my kitchen table. I had never owned a pocket watch in my life. It resembled the style I'd glimpsed on that apparition, a burnished bronze surface with intricate scrollwork. My heart thudded with the realization that somehow I had carried a piece of that other time into my own home. The watch's ticking filled the silence of my apartment, and its methodical clicks felt like a countdown to something I didn't understand. Soon more unfamiliar items started appearing. A program for a play from decades past, a costume accessory that looked handmade, a battered fountain pen. Each arrival jolted me with a fresh wave of anxiety. My mouth would go dry whenever I spotted a new relic on my coffee table or in my closet. It was as though the boundary between the theater's timeline and my life was disintegrating, and the nightmares began in my dreams. I was on stage under those hot lights, performing scenes I had never rehearsed but knew by heart. The audience was invisible, yet I felt hundreds of eyes on me, dissecting my every move. My pulse hammered, my lungs ached with shallow breaths, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat. Occasionally, I felt I wasn't alone when I opened my eyes. A sense of a presence lingered just outside my vision, like a shape hidden in the corner of the bedroom. I'd lie there, heart pounding so loudly I could hear each thump, Wondering if it was real or just my mind fracturing under stress, I began experiencing fragments of old memories, but they weren't mine. Late at night, I'd smell stage makeup and hear the muted applause of an audience. Sometimes I'd find myself humming tunes from musicals that hadn't been performed in decades. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appeared off as if something behind my own eyes was a stranger. Fear gnawed at me constantly, a tension coiling in my stomach until I felt nauseated. I tried to share my concerns with a close friend over the phone, but she only remarked that I sounded exhausted. She suggested I take a break from the theater and get some rest when I dared to return to the theater. Compelled by my job and a strange fascination, I noticed that the stage lights would flicker as soon as I stepped in. It was as though the building recognized me, trying not to panic. I made my way through the labyrinth of hallways, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every distant echo that made my skin crawl. The air felt thicker now, as though saturated with the tension of multiple eras pressing in. At once my mouth was perpetually dry, and I had to keep swallowing to fight the tightness in my throat. In hushed tones, the director of the current production confided that some staff had witnessed phenomena reminiscent of old performances, seamlessly blending with present rehearsals. She avoided looking at me directly, as if fearing that acknowledging my experiences would confirm something too frightening to articulate. I nodded, feeling sweat collecting at the base of my neck, wanting to say something about how real these apparitions were, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My voice felt trapped in my chest, lodged behind the pounding of my heart. One particular night, I set up additional spotlights for a new scene. Determined not to make contact with any apparitions, I moved methodically, checking cables and adjusting angles. Then I saw a faint glow emanating from the wings with each step toward that glow. The hair on my arms stood up, the stage seemed to warp under my feet, the boards creaking in an endless echo. I peered around the curtain and found another scene in progress. A man and a woman conversing in frantic whispers, dressed in clothes from many decades ago. Their voices were distant yet urgent, as if trying to solve some crisis in their storyline. I knew I should leave them to their loop, but I couldn't help stepping forward. My pulse throbbed at my temples and my breathing grew ragged. An overwhelming compulsion to intervene coursed through me. Something deeper than curiosity, almost a primal urge to help them break free, or maybe it was me wanting answers, so I leaned in just enough to be seen, and the moment our gazes met, I felt a rush of cold air tear through the space. The lights above sparked, then dimmed for a heartbeat. I thought everything had gone dark, but I was wrong. They vanished, yet I felt their presence within me, as if I'd opened a door that could never be sealed. My body trembled violently and sweat stung my eyes. I ran out of the theater, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I sprinted down the street, half expecting something to chase me. Even after I shut my apartment door behind me, I sensed an unnatural stillness. My own living room felt like a stage set in the following days. More bizarre artifacts appeared, old theater tickets scattered near my sofa, a hand-sewn vest in my closet, a script from a production long before my time, and the visions intensified while waiting for the elevator in my building. I glimpsed a reflection of a corridor behind me that didn't match my reality. It looked like an aged version of the hallway, with faded wallpaper and flickering lanterns. My heart pounded so fiercely that my knees wobbled. When I turned around, there was only the modern corridor I knew, but the pit in my stomach told me I was only half in the present. Now I realized I couldn't continue like this. Anxiety had me jumping at every noise. The tension in my neck and shoulders made me constantly ache. Nights were worse, filled with nightmares that bled into my waking hours. Finally, I decided to confront the theater head-on, hoping to sever whatever link I'd forged. Gathering my tools, I returned late one evening, determined to remove every piece of lighting equipment I'd installed, as if that might break the cycle. Inside, the building felt more oppressive than ever. Every corridor was dimly lit by dying bulbs. A low hum resonated through the walls, and it felt like stepping into a giant maw. I forced myself onto the stage, grappling with the spotlights and cables, determined to undo my previous work the moment I started unscrewing a fixture. I heard footsteps behind me, modern heavy boots. This time, not phantom echoes from the past, a stagehand approached in the darkness, saying in subdued tones that the director had told him to leave me alone for the night, but that if I needed help, he'd remain nearby. I thanked him with a nod, trying not to let my trembling hands show in the glow of his flashlight alone. Again, I removed each light with slow precision, focusing on every twist of the screwdriver. My mind spun. I felt as though time itself was pressing against me, each second reverberating in my ears, each minute marked by a surge of adrenaline. The building groaned around me, or maybe that was just my imagination. My breath rattled in my chest and sweat trickled down my temples. Yet I persisted, dismantling everything piece by piece. After what felt like hours, I finished. A sense of uneasy calm washed over me, and I stood center stage, gazing at the shadows of the auditorium. My heart hammered as I declared mostly to myself that I was done. No direct response came, only a distant creak of wood. Then a curious stillness settled over the space. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back until I was at the exit. A week passed and no new relics appeared in my apartment. The pocket watch still ticked ominously, but I stashed it in a drawer out of sight. My dreams, although still uneasy, began to fade back into mundane images of daily life. Yet the memory of that theater with its overlapping timelines remained an open wound in my psyche. My sense of normality was forever changed. I still jump at random flickers of light or unexpected reflections in mirrors. If there was a victory, it was that I preserved my grip on reality just enough to carry on. But I can't fully escape the feeling that part of me is still in that theater, trapped in the cycles of old performances. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear the faint tune of an ancient musical score drifting through my apartment walls. My heart races and a cold sweat prickles on my skin. I close my eyes and remind myself to breathe. Whatever force binds that theater exists just beneath the surface of what we call real. I manage to pull most of myself out, but I suspect a fragment remains forever locked in that place where past and present blur into a single haunting performance. And every so often I can almost feel it calling me back. Story 11. The rain hammered on the windows with such intensity that it felt like an attack from the outside world, a warning that something in the atmosphere had shifted. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and a prickling sensation crawled up my arms as I stood in my living room, staring at the rivulets of water snaking down the glass. There was a pressure in the air. Thick, suffocating, my skin felt clammy, and the light around me dimmed, as though the electricity itself had lost its will to illuminate. Even the lamp in the corner flickered erratically, revealing the corners of the room with unsettling shadows. The day I first sensed this pressure, I knew my life would never be the same. A few weeks prior, I had managed to avoid a potentially horrific accident. I had been driving along a familiar highway on a sunny afternoon, feeling carefree, my mind wandering to trivial errands without warning. A crushing certainty spread through my chest. I saw with terrifying clarity an image of twisted metal, broken glass, and my own arms pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard. My heart started pounding so violently that I actually pulled over onto the shoulder, shaking and drenched in sweat. Seconds later, a truck sped by, losing control on the exact stretch where I would have driven if I hadn't stopped. The truck skidded, scraping the guardrail, filling the highway with the deafening screech of steel on concrete. My entire body was trembling. I tasted bile in my mouth as my adrenaline surged. I realized with a cold wave of fear that I had somehow foreseen the accident. In the days following that experience, my perception of the world changed in ways I could never have anticipated. It started with subtle flashes at the edges of my vision, little sparks of light, glimmers of color dancing around people's bodies. Once I was walking through a grocery store when I noticed faint halos hovering around the employees, shimmering like heat waves off asphalt. My breath caught in my throat and my pulse accelerated. I told myself it was fatigue, maybe a visual trick from the fluorescent lighting. Yet the more I tried to dismiss it, the more persistent these colorful outlines became. It was as though I was seeing something that hovered just outside the normal spectrum of sight. Then came the day when I noticed lines almost like threads of light weaving around strangers on the street. If I focused, I sensed them radiating from each person, branching out in dozens of directions, all drifting into the distance. When I closed my eyes, the same lines lingered in the darkness behind my eyelids, pulsing with an uncanny vibrancy. I walked around in a constant state of hyper-awareness, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird in my rib cage. Every noise, every flicker of motion felt amplified. My skin tingled with apprehension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the threshold of two worlds. At once, the tangible reality and something deeper, more arcane. Gradually, these visions intensified. I began to see shapes, silhouettes, or something akin to echoes outside my window at night. Whenever I turned my head, they vanished, leaving me gasping in alarm. My apartment, once a sanctuary of comforting stillness, felt haunted by an otherworldly presence I couldn't sleep without the lights on my chest, seized with dread whenever darkness enclosed me. The sense that I was being observed lurked in every corner, making my palms sweat, and my heartbeat hammered loud enough to keep me awake. I recalled how after the premonition on the highway, my life was spared by what felt like a cosmic intervention. Now I wondered if something had noticed that intervention one night as I tried to settle into the worn-out cushions of my couch. I sensed a flicker in the air as though the space in front of me warped momentarily. My temples throbbed and I felt a wave of nausea along with a tingling along my spine. I blinked and realized that I could see my living room in two versions at once. In one version, the lamp in the corner was glowing. A steady, soft yellow in the other, the lamp's light flickered and pulsed with a sickly greenish hue, casting crooked shadows on the walls. As I looked down at my hands, I saw them superimposed over each other in slightly different positions. My breath caught and my vision blurred for a second, forcing me to grip the edge of the couch until my knuckles turned white. A cold sweat formed on my forehead, and my heart pounded against my ribcage. This shift, this split in reality, lasted only a moment when it passed. I was left with a deep sense of unease and an unshakable panic. Despite my utter bewilderment, I tried to continue my daily routine. I went to work pretending that my smiles and polite nods were genuine, although inside my nerves were fraying. At times, my body would feel so tense that my shoulders ached and my breath came in shallow bursts, as if I were constantly bracing for an invisible impact I confided in. No one, how could I explain that I was seeing alternate realities flicker in and out of my vision? How could I tell anyone that sometimes I glimpsed a shimmering aura around them? Lines of possible futures stretching out from their shoulders like the legs of a sprawling spider. No words could accurately capture the dread that crawled through my veins. Before long, these multiple realities began to bleed into one another more frequently. I would be sitting at my desk trying to finish a mundane task when I would see a second desk overlapping the first, or a second version of my own hand turning the pages of a notebook that wasn't actually there. My ears started picking up faint whispers, muffled voices that seemed to be calling to me through layers of static. My heart rate skyrocketed each time, pounding so loudly I thought everyone in the office must hear it, but no one seemed to notice the silent chaos unfurling inside me at night. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. I perceived indistinct figures outside my window when I mustered the courage to approach the glass. They weren't there yet. A lingering tension in the air convinced me I hadn't imagined them sometimes in that liminal zone between waking and dreaming. I heard a faint scraping against the window, or a rustling just beyond the curtains. I'd bolt upright, chest-tight hair standing on end. My throat would feel dry and a hollow ache would gnaw at my stomach. In those moments, my vision would briefly split again, revealing another version of my room, one where shadowy silhouettes stretched across the ceiling in unnatural angles, pulsating gently like they were breathing days blurred, and my consciousness seemed to slip in and out of these overlapping realities. Without warning, I soon noticed that certain shapes, perhaps they were entities, were following me. Whenever I was out in public, I felt an overwhelming sense of being observed. Sweat prickled beneath my clothes and a rowing dread swelled in my gut. In a crowded street, I noticed the same tall figure in my peripheral vision. When I turned my head, I caught only the faintest glimpse of a form that seemed vaguely humanoid, yet lacked distinctive features. It evaporated the instant my gaze focused on it. My mind raced with the implications had my expanded perception. alerted something to my presence was I now visible to them. Just as they were becoming visible to me, I became consumed by the idea that these watchers were not benevolent. Perhaps my near miss on the highway had awakened a potential inside me, an ability to sense the hidden architecture of reality, and in turn to be sensed by powers beyond normal comprehension. Each night I tried to calm myself, telling my reflection in the mirror that I was simply tired, overworked, imagining impossible scenarios, but a tight knot of panic remained coiled in my stomach, impossible to ignore. My hands trembled at the thought of going to sleep, unsure if I would find myself witnessing yet another fracturing of my own surroundings. It was during one of these fitful nights that the lines of possible futures around me flared with astounding intensity. I had been lying in bed, sheets soaked with my sweat, when suddenly the entire bedroom glowed with an otherworldly light. Dozens, maybe hundreds of luminous strands extended from every piece of furniture, from every corner, swirling and crossing in elaborate patterns. My pulse became thunder in my ears, and I struggled to breathe. I sat up disoriented, watching as the walls themselves seemed to ripple. That was when I truly saw them, entities drifting in the spaces between these threads of light. They were elongated, indistinct, and their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a faint luminescence. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and my scalp tingled so intensely it felt as though insects were crawling over my head. I felt them studying me, their gazes piercing through my physical form and into my mind. My heart was pounding so violently that my vision blurred at the edges. I couldn't move or speak, an invisible weight pressed against my chest. In that moment, my perceptions fractured further, and I saw multiple overlapping versions of my room. One room had the lamp shining with a comforting warm glow, while in another, everything was dark, except for the faint outlines of these entities. In a third, I saw shimmering lines of possibility dancing in the air like ghostly ribbons, desperate to ground myself. I clutched the bed frame nails, digging into the wood. I felt tears in my eyes, not from pain, but from sheer terror. Inside my head, I could almost sense them communicating in low vibrations, trying to warn or threaten me. I wasn't sure which. My breathing grew ragged, my chest heaving in short gasps. Sweat poured down my forehead, and my shirt clung to my back. I tried to scream, but could only produce a strangled wheeze. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my limbs shake uncontrollably. Eventually, the night receded, and I woke up the next morning with an aching body, my head pounding as if it had been used as a drum. Every muscle felt stiff, as though I had been tensed in place for hours. My eyes stung with fatigue, and my mouth was bone dry, as though I had been parched for days. I stumbled to the bathroom, half expecting to see those same haunting silhouettes behind me, although nothing was there. The weight of their observation never left me. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to snap myself out of this nightmare. But the memory of those multiple realities overlaying each other remained vivid, scorching my mind's eye. As the weeks went on, I decided I needed to confront the phenomenon, or at least understand it enough to navigate my life without constant, paralyzing fear. I sought out books on auras, astral projection, esoteric knowledge, any scrap of information I could find that might explain my new ability. According to one obscure tome, individuals who narrowly escape grave accidents sometimes develop an extended perception, a rift that allows them to glimpse parallel existences. However, it warned that such a shift in consciousness could attract the attention of non-human entities that exist between these realities. Reading that made my stomach twist, my entire body tensed with dread as I recognized the severity of my predicament. I realized that my uncanny luck in avoiding that highway disaster might have opened a doorway, and that door wasn't just letting me peek out, it was also letting something else in. I stopped sleeping for more than an hour or two at a time. Each small noise at night jolted me awake, heart racing, every nerve in my body on high alert. My dreams were laced with creeping shadows and labyrinths of fractured reality. During the day, I saw double images of everyday scenes, a sidewalk turning into a spiraling path, an office corridor leading to an endless hallway in another dimension. My head felt perpetually light, and I was haunted by the notion that my mind was splintering under the strain of seeing too much simple tasks became exercises in focus. I had to remind myself which reality I was operating in, telling myself that the coffee mug in front of me was real, while the shimmering half-faded mug overlapping it might be from another timeline. One afternoon, I caught sight of one of those entities standing just inside my peripheral vision in broad daylight on a sidewalk near my office building. My pulse thudded in my chest and I froze mid-step. Pedestrians brushed past me, but no one seemed to notice the tall, indistinct shape the air around me felt. Electric crackling with unseen energy. My breath came in shallow gulps. I sensed it was a silent threat, or perhaps a warning. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten, and forced myself to keep walking, telling my legs to move, even though they felt like sacks of sand. The figure didn't vanish this time. It lingered a moment longer before fading out like a mirage, dissolving in a heat wave. That night, locked in my apartment with the doors double bolted and every light blazing, I confronted a choice: remain paralyzed by fear or attempt to face these watchers. My hands trembled as I lowered myself onto the living room floor, crossing my legs in a makeshift meditation posture. I inhaled through my nose, exhaled through my mouth, repeating the process until my pulse steadied just enough to remain coherent. Closing my eyes, I focused on the swirling darkness behind my lids. Almost immediately, a kaleidoscope of lights flared, revealing those luminous threads of possibility beyond them. I perceived shapes and shadows flickering. I concentrated on a single question repeated in my mind like a mantra. Why are you watching me? There was no spoken response, no clear voice. Instead, a crushing wave of emotion and imagery broke over my senses as though I was experiencing a fragmented transmission. My body shuddered violently and goosebumps prickled across my skin. I felt a presence press in on me from all sides, pushing the air from my lungs. Then for an instant, I glimpsed what lay behind the veil: an endless network of timelines branching out in every direction like roots of a colossal cosmic tree. At the edges of these roots dwelled numerous entities, drifting between realities, their forms constantly shifting as they observed me, curious yet seemingly cautious. When I opened my eyes, tears streamed down my cheeks and my breathing was ragged. Still, a curious calm settled over my chest. My heart was racing, but not in blind panic. This time it was more like anticipation. I sensed that these watchers weren't necessarily malevolent. They had noticed my expanded perception the moment I swerved away from fate on that highway, and now they were studying whether I would succumb to terror or evolve beyond it. Slowly, I pushed myself up from the floor, wiping the sweat from my brow. A faint trembling persisted in my hands, but I felt a newfound determination in the days that followed. I experimented gingerly with my ability whenever I saw the overlapping realities. I tried to breathe steadily, acknowledging them rather than recoiling. Strange as it was, I realized each timeline was like a ripple in a vast ocean. I could feel the shifting currents, the gravitational pull of events that might happen, might never happen, or were happening in parallel. The watchers appeared less frequently, perhaps because I was learning not to panic at every flicker in the air. I still felt them there, lingering at the edges, but they seemed more like silent guardians than hunters. I won't pretend that everything has become easy. I still have nights when I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I see one of those tall silhouettes in the corner or sense them outside my window. My heart still jackhammers in my chest. My mouth dries up and a cold flush scuttles along my spine. But now there's also a small spark of defiance inside me, a realization that I am capable of navigating the labyrinth of these multiple realities. My fear, while ever present, is tempered by a cautious curiosity. I survived that highway incident for a reason. It wasn't just luck, it was the opening of a door in my consciousness. I'm learning slowly to walk the line between terror and acceptance, to stay grounded in one reality. Even as I sense countless others, the watchers remain their presence, an unsettling reminder that I've stepped into a realm beyond ordinary human awareness. But if they expected me to collapse under the weight of my new perception, they might be disappointed. I may still quake with dread when I feel them near, but I refuse to lose myself to horror sometimes. In the hush of midnight, when the rain batters my windows and the shadows on my walls stretch to impossible lengths, I sense that unsettling pressure in the air. Once again, my heart picks up pace and my palms sweat, but I whisper inwardly that I'm still here, still fighting to keep my grip on the fragile thread of normally, and in that whisper there is resolve, because no matter how many versions of reality I see and no matter how many entities lurk at the perimeter of my vision, I have chosen to remain in my original reality. Whatever that truly means, the watchers might observe me indefinitely, but they cannot take away my will to stand firm. Eyes open, determined to face each new fracture and distortion without surrendering. I learned that facing the unknown can be both terrifying and liberating. I carry the weight of my expanded awareness, and I feel the watcher's curious, unwavering attention. Every time my reality splits in two, yet I'm here caught between multiple worlds. Living proof that sometimes the veil can be lifted and still one can find the courage to persist. And though I may never banish the fear entirely, I've accepted it as part of my existence in this twisted, shimmering tapestry of possibilities. Story 12, I still remember the first night I sensed something was off in that cramped dorm room. The ceiling light flickered in a rhythmic pulse, like a dying firefly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. My heart pounded so heavily I could feel its vibrations through my ribs, and there was a sudden chill in the air that had no business existing in that overheated college building from that moment. Dread seemed to seep into every corner of my life. I had transferred to this university at the start of the semester, eager for new experiences and better opportunities. My roommate Colin appeared ordinary enough, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. He was majoring in ancient studies, a discipline I hadn't even known existed. We shared polite greetings, a few jokes, and typical small talk, but there was a strange quality to our interactions that I could never quite define. Initially, I dismissed it as social awkwardness. I remember shrugging it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, that everyone in a new environment feels some level of discomfort. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started subtly. I'd wake up in the middle of the night because of strange mutterings from Colin's side of the room. My initial thought was that he was simply talking in his sleep, as many people do, but his tone and inflection were unsettling, low, guttural, laced with an otherworldly cadence. Sometimes it would sound like a chant, other times it was a single phrase repeated with increasing urgency. There were nights I thought I caught the syllables sliding into something that resembled Latin or maybe Greek, though I couldn't place any exact words. The next morning, when I asked him indirectly if he had nightmares, he would blink in confusion and say he didn't recall any dreams at all. His calm demeanor almost convinced me I had imagined everything. The real terror began the night I woke up to the bed creaking in an odd rhythm. The sound was like someone shifting their weight, but it went on for too long to be a normal toss and turn. My eyes adjusted to the darkness and I saw Colin hovering. Yes, literally hovering an inch or two above his mattress. My vision seemed to shake at first. I thought I was seeing illusions born from sleep deprivation, but when I rubbed my eyes and focused, the image remained chillingly real. He was elevated just enough that the gap beneath him was unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. Fear lodged itself in my chest, making my pulse hammer so loud I could practically hear the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to turn on the lamp, but found myself frozen in place, my fingers gripping the edge of the sheets with such force that my knuckles turned white. My lips felt chapped and I was sweating in the cold night air. Then in one horrific moment, he spoke in a voice that didn't belong to him. It was a low hiss, layered with a whisper that seemed to resonate from somewhere deeper, older. I caught only fragments of meaning, something about unholy gates, and the watchers beyond the rest felt like words from an ancient text drenched in malice. The next morning, Colin didn't remember anything, and there was a bruise on his arm. He couldn't explain. He asked why I looked so pale. I pretended I had pulled an all-nighter, and he gave me a sympathetic nod. His eyes seemed vacant, as if something had hollowed them out that day. I tried to focus on my classes, but my concentration fractured. With every stray thought of the previous night, my mind replayed the image of Colin's body hovering above the bed. I nearly dropped my pen when I realized my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't keep a steady grip late that afternoon. I stopped by the campus library searching for anything that might illuminate what I had witnessed. Books on folklore, possession, demonic manifestations. All of it seemed too bizarre for my rational mind. I began to question my own sanity. Perhaps I had been half asleep, or maybe it was a hallucination triggered by stress. Still, some old texts I skimmed referenced phenomena eerily similar. Ancient tongues spoken in the dead of night, floating bodies, cryptic knowledge that no mortal should possess. By the time I left the library, darkness had settled and the walk back to the dorm felt like navigating a labyrinth of shadows. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, certain I was being watched by something I couldn't see that night. Things escalated. I woke up coughing, my throat feeling scorched. An overpowering smell of sulfur drifted through the room. Colin was upright on his bed, eyes wide and unfocused. Chanting the words were guttural, intermixed with deep rasping sounds that seemed too loud for a human throat. Though I didn't understand the language, I sensed it was ancient. Older than anything I had encountered in my research, a faint trembling crawled through my limbs, leaving me gasping for air. Then abruptly his voice changed. It dropped an octave and seemed to echo the entity, or whatever had taken hold of him. Started referencing my childhood events. No one else could possibly know it. Mentioned a time I had an accident in a neighbor's backyard and the sensation of guilt I carried for a secret. I'd never shared. My stomach roiled in fear as if a cold hand had squeezed my insides. I could taste acid rising in my throat, and my forehead was slick with sweat. The next morning I discovered something new. Symbols, strange symbols, had appeared on the wall near my bed, twisting lines and jagged shapes drawn in a substance the color of dried blood. My lungs clenched in panic when I saw them. They looked like they had been scratched into the paint. Yet when I touched them, the substance felt wet and sticky. A metallic odor lingered just beneath the surface, but the moment my fingertip made contact, the stain evaporated. It vanished into thin air, leaving not even a smear. My pulse throbbed in my wrists. I stared at my trembling hand in disbelief, feeling like my reality had snapped out of joint. In the days that followed, those symbols reappeared with maddening frequency, sometimes on the ceiling, other times on the underside of my desk or even on the door. Always that same dark, rust-cold liquid that would disappear at the slightest touch. I tried to tell myself it was some elaborate prank, but the campus was hardly known for occult enthusiasts. More importantly, I couldn't figure out how anyone could get into our locked room so consistently without leaving a trace. As my suspicions grew, so did the sense of being watched. I began noticing subtle movement out of the corner of my eye, dark forms that would vanish. The moment I looked directly at them in class, I found it impossible to focus. My heart would race without warning, and a persistent chill clung to my skin. No matter how many layers I wore at night, I lay awake bracing myself for the next unnatural occurrence. I considered sleeping in the lounge area or requesting a dorm change, but I was half convinced that I carried the threat with me, that whatever was tormenting Colin had extended its reach to me. The tension coiled tighter each day. Colin grew paler, the circles under his eyes darkening to a bruised purple. When I asked if he was feeling unwell, he answered in clipped phrases that somehow had a hollow ring, like a recording that had been played too many times. He would occasionally glance at me with a perplexed expression, as though trying to recognize my face but failing. I caught him studying the same ancient texts I had spotted in the library's restricted sections. Their titles were etched in archaic scripts I couldn't decipher whenever I approached. He'd slam the book shut and mutter something about me interrupting his research. His attitude was unnerving. He seemed present yet distant, like an echo of the person he used to be one evening while brushing my teeth. I noticed the lights in the hallway flickering again. A soft hum filled the air like an electrical surge. My stomach churned with an instinctive dread. When I returned to our room, I almost gagged at the smell. It was a pungent mix of sulfur and decay, overwhelming my senses. Colin was standing by the wall, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes so wide they looked ready to burst. He whispered something I couldn't fully catch, but it sounded like an ancient invocation. Then his body jerked forward as though some invisible hand had seized him. I stumbled back against my desk, heart hammering as I tried to quell the rising panic. The overhead light buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow across his rigid figure. He spoke again in that foreign tongue, and I recognized a few repeated phrases from the previous nights. I trembled, uncertain whether to run or stay. A voice in my mind screamed that I should get help, but I couldn't tear myself away from him. My mouth went dry. Every breath was a shallow gasp that failed to calm me. Suddenly his expression shifted. It contorted into a semblance of recognition, and he told me, though not directly, more like a statement spat out between guttural sounds, that the entity inside him was hungering for more, that it thrived on fear and secrets. I took a step back, heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst through my chest. I realized then that my fear was feeding whatever was tormenting him. I forced myself to inhale deeply, though my lungs felt as though they were wrapped in ice. At that point, I tried to confront the phenomenon. In a fractured whisper, I called out to whatever resided within Colin, demanding it leave him. My voice quavered, my throat tight, but I didn't stop. I stammered some half-remembered words from my research. Though I had no idea if they held any real power, the entity reacted by contorting Colin's body, and he collapsed to the floor, letting out a ragged exhalation. The moment he hit the ground, the entire room seemed to vibrate with a low hum, then fell eerily silent. He lay there, breathing shallowly, eyes shut. My hand shook so badly it took me a moment to kneel beside him. All the color seemed drained from his face, but he was alive. He stirred, murmuring my name when he looked up. His eyes were suddenly clear, like he was fully himself. For the first time in weeks, he asked what had happened. I could only shake my head, tears threatening to spill as I felt a rush of both relief and lingering terror. For the next several days, I hardly left his side. Every once in a while, I caught glimpses of those symbols creeping onto the walls, faint and flickering. But they would fade as soon as I noticed them. I began to suspect there was some sort of tenuous struggle unfolding within. Colin, each time the symbols or the chanting threatened to emerge, he seemed to fight it off with a grimace of pain. I'd find him gripping the edge of the bed, sweat pouring down his face as he tried to maintain control. Eventually, we agreed, though, in hushed, anxious undertones, that he needed help beyond what any of our textbooks could provide. I considered contacting a professor who specialized in ancient languages, but the risk of being dismissed as delusional was too great. Instead, I decided it might be better to take a short leave from the dorm. A friend of mine had an off-campus apartment, so I asked if I could crash there for a few days. My friend obliged without pressing for details, perhaps sensing the desperation in my voice. My last night in that room, I was packing up some essentials when I heard a faint rasp behind me. Colin stood by his bed, arms limp at his sides, eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. He said, though not exactly in direct words, that if I left, it would follow me. A wave of nausea hit me. The threat was clear. The entity wasn't confined to him alone. My spine prickled with cold sweat as the sense of being trapped swelled in my chest, but something in me refused to bend. I told him quietly that I needed air, needed to clear my mind, and that I would return once I figured out a plan. He gave a slow-weighted nod, like he understood, but couldn't promise anything would improve. Walking out of that dorm felt like walking away from a nightmare, yet the dread followed me. Every sound in the corridor echoed off the walls, making my skin crawl when I finally stepped outside. The night air felt freezing against my damp skin, but I breathed in as much as I could, feeling my heart thrash in my chest. I remember wiping the sweat from my brow, my arms trembling from adrenaline and fear at my friend's apartment. I tried to sleep on the couch, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the echo of those ancient whispers, felt that unnatural chill on my skin. My heart would start racing, my mouth turning as dry as sand. Paranoia drilled into my thoughts. Maybe the symbols would appear on this very wall. Maybe I would start speaking in that guttural voice. The idea took root, and I couldn't stop shaking. I paced around the small living room until dawn, feeling more like a cornered animal than a college student in the morning. A fragile resolve hardened within me. I realized that ignoring or fleeing from this horror only tightened its grip on me and possibly on Colin. So I returned to campus, my pulse spiking with every step closer to the dorm. The hallways seemed darker than usual, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. When I opened the door, I half expected to find more of those blood-like symbols scrolled across the walls. Instead, I found Colin sitting quietly at the edge of his bed. The room was immaculate, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet the odor of sulfur lingered faintly in the air. Pricking at my nostrils, Colin looked up his eyes, carrying a weight of resignation. He admitted indirectly that the presence wasn't gone, but it had weakened. He believed that acknowledging it, confronting it, had broken some portion of its hold. My heart clenched with cautious relief, though my body still pulsed with the memory of fear. The quiet that followed was heavy, not peaceful, like a lull in the midst of an ongoing storm. Classes continued as usual, but my life never returned to normal. I started wearing headphones everywhere, not to listen to music, but to block out the hush of unseen footsteps or the faintest echo of chanting that might drift through the corridors. I kept a small notebook scribbling down every unexplained detail. I noticed the fleeting shadows, the goosebumps, the unnerving hush that sometimes fell over a crowded room. Whether the entity still lurked in Colin or followed me, I couldn't say, but I felt its presence like a pressure in the back of my mind the final weekend of the semester. I woke up early, drenched in sweat. My heart hammered as I saw those symbols again, faintly visible on the mirror across from my bed. Nearly transparent in the morning light, I forced myself to reach out and touch them. My fingertips came away clean and dry, the markings vanishing as always. A surge of defiance welled up inside me. I wasn't going to let this thing break me. If it thrived on fear, I would offer as little as possible. Still, the sense of unease never truly left me. Colin and I both decided to move out at the semester's end, but we avoided describing our experiences to the housing staff. We feared we'd be labeled as disturbed or worse, that our story would draw more attention from those dark corners of the world we had glimpsed on the day I left that dorm room for good. I paused before stepping into the hallway. My skin tingled with the memory of countless sleepless nights, whispered incantations, and the sight of a body floating inches above the bed. I could almost taste my own anxiety, bitter and metallic on my tongue. I don't know if whatever plagued that space was truly gone even now. In my new apartment, I sometimes notice the faint outlines of symbols on the edges of my vision dissolving into nothing. The moment I blink, my hands still tremble occasionally, and my pulse can spike without warning, as if my body anticipates something lurking behind the veil. Of normally, there are nights I sit straight up in bed, drenched in cold sweat, convinced I hear the guttural chanting in the distance. I've tried rationalizing it: stress, leftover trauma, and overactive imagination. But deep down, I suspect the entity remains drifting in unseen realms watching me. Colin and I still keep in touch mostly through cautious text messages. Neither of us admits we've truly escaped that lingering darkness. We just maintain a silent understanding. We survive something that defies explanation, and that survival comes with a price, an imprint of dread etched into our minds, a permanent crack in the safe bubble we once called reality on. Especially quiet nights. I'll find myself staring into a dark corner of my room, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, the shadows twisting into shapes I can't quite describe. My breath grows rapid. My eyes water, and I'm left with the distinct and inescapable sensation that something is there, waiting, biding its time. Even though I made it out of that dorm, the echoes remain a suffocating reminder that some horrors never truly music end story. 13. I remember the first time it happened. The silence of my apartment at 4 in the morning felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, and I swore something was breathing in the darkness with me. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of traffic outside seemed strangely magnified, as though the world had become a distorted echo chamber in that suffocating hush. My instincts told me something was there, watching, waiting, and poised to reach out. I wish I could say that moment was fleeting, But it was only the beginning of a series of events that would leave me questioning my own sanity. My name is Daniel, and I've spent years climbing the corporate ladder in Sao Paulo. Negotiations, frantic meetings, and perpetual networking have always been my environment. I used to relish the chaotic pulse of the city, the congested streets, the honking horns, the bright neon signs that blinked all night. Somehow the overload of sensory input comforted me because it reminded me I wasn't alone. That was before I started dreaming about the samurai. It began as a recurring nightmare. I don't recall every detail, but the focal point was always a lone figure clad in ancient armor plates of metal and strips of worn leather intricately tied together, his hands resting on the hilt of a long blade. His face was mostly hidden behind an imposing helm, yet I could sense his eyes fixed on me. Night after night, I'd see him standing in a moonlit field under a sprawling cherry tree with withered blossoms. Despite the armor, his presence emanated a silent urgency as though he were fighting against the boundary of my dream. To deliver a warning over time, his silent form began to speak without words. It felt like thoughts echoing in my head, urging me not to travel. At first, it was unclear where he was forbidding me to go, but soon it became obvious my company had been planning to transfer me to Tokyo for several months. A huge opportunity, one that I had enthusiastically pursued in these nightmares. The samurai's intent was unmistakable. He wanted me to stay away. I tried to brush it off as subconscious anxiety. Moving to a foreign country was obviously stressful. But each morning I woke up drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering so violently that it felt like it might burst through my ribs. The worst part was the paralyzing terror that remained. Once I opened my eyes, I'd stare into the shadows of my bedroom, convinced the samurai might step out from some corner of the room. My pillow and sheets would be damp, and my chest would ache from shallow breathing. I remember wanting to dismiss these dreams as random nightmares, yet something in me couldn't shake off the dread. 3 weeks before my scheduled relocation, my boss called to say the transfer was canceled. He used indirect, almost apologetic language, explaining that the Tokyo office had decided to scale back expansions. I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt an uncanny flood of relief. My dreams had grown more frantic in the days leading up to that phone call, and part of me believed this was exactly what the samurai had wanted from that moment. Something shifted. The nightmares continued, but the tone changed. I still found myself in the moonlight field, but the samurai no longer stood rigid and menacing. Instead, he lowered his head in what felt like gratitude. If I tried to run toward him to demand answers, my feet sank into the earth and I always jolted awake. The relief I felt about not traveling to Tokyo mingled uneasily with confusion about why I was so certain he had saved me from something. Life didn't return to normal. In fact, the sense of unease deepened one night while brushing my teeth. I felt a presence behind me. The reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off. The faint overhead lighting flickered, and I was sure I saw the silhouette of armor just behind my left shoulder before I could spin around it. Vanished. The sudden shift in my reflection sent a shiver so intense it rippled through my entire body. My mouth went dry instantly, and I bit my tongue in shock, tasting the metallic tang of blood. My breathing quickened, and I gripped the edge of the sink with whitening knuckles. My heart was pounding like a desperate fist on a locked door, urging me to flee over. The next few days, my apartment turned into a labyrinth of reflections where I caught glimpses of that same shadowy figure in the polished surface of my coffee table, in the tinted windows of my office building, even in the water pitcher at a friend's dinner party. Each time it appeared for the briefest instant, a flicker of armored shape behind me. Whenever I tried to pinpoint it, the figure vanished. The fleeting nature of these sightings might have left some room for doubt, but the dread in my gut was real. I felt a constant trickle of cold sweat along my spine, an itch of paranoia that made me look over my shoulder. More often than I cared to admit, it wasn't just reflections. Objects from Japan, gifts from colleagues who had traveled there, items I had collected in anticipation of my move, started shifting in inexplicable ways. A decorative katana I kept on my wall would tilt slightly at odd angles as if someone had jostled it. A lacquered wooden box I used for tea supplies once ended up on the floor across the room, its contents spilled. Late one night, I heard the distinct rustle of fabric near the corner of my living room, only to find a small Japanese tapestry lying on the ground. Nobody else was in my apartment. It felt like something was drawing attention to these items, manipulating them to remind me of Tokyo, a place I was no longer going. Fear took on a physical dimension. My heart rate stayed elevated throughout the day. Sometimes I had to step into a quiet hallway at work and lean my forehead against the cool wall just to regulate my breathing. I'd close my eyes and count my breaths. Feeling the sweat trickle down the back of my neck, I kept telling myself I was losing it, that this was all stress-induced hallucination, but deep down I knew something unexplainable was happening. One afternoon I decided to photograph my apartment, hoping to capture any oddities. I wondered if I might see the silhouette that kept dogging my reflections when I checked the pictures on my computer. Later I felt my stomach lurch and twist in every image where a mirror or reflective surface was visible. I saw him a faint outline the shape of armor behind me. His body was always angled slightly as though he was guarding me from behind, or perhaps looming over me. Yet with my own eyes, I had seen nothing. In the moment the shutter clicked, confronted by this evidence, a wave of nausea rolled through me. My vision blurred and I found myself gasping for air, the room spinning with a dread that was almost overwhelming. I thought about deleting the photos, pretending they never existed, but a part of me wanted answers, so I tried to research historical samurai old folklore or anything that might explain a protective spirit or vengeful apparition. I pored over websites in Portuguese and English, skimmed through legends of warriors bound by honor ghosts that appear in times of crisis and stories of curses that followed families for generations, but nothing felt specific enough to my situation. A colleague who I told the bare minimum mentioned I should speak to someone knowledgeable about Japanese history or spiritual customs. I tried to do so indirectly, careful not to seem unhinged. My colleague relayed a message from an acquaintance. Spirits tied to objects or locations often remain to guide or warn. That was all I got. It didn't really calm my nerves. Instead, it deepened the sense that I was wrestling with something beyond my understanding. The paranoia grew. Nights became unbearable. The hush of my apartment transformed into a threat I couldn't see. I started hearing faint footsteps in the hallway, though I lived alone and the corridor was locked. The air seemed perpetually chilly, as if a draft was blowing in from nowhere. My throat went dry at random moments, as though fear itself was choking me. At times, my hands would shake so violently that I struggled to handle basic tasks like pouring coffee or checking my phone. It was as if my body remained in a perpetual fight or flight mode, pumping me full of adrenaline one night. I tried to calm myself by making tea in that wooden box that had once moved on its own. My mind drifted to the possibility that perhaps the spirit was grateful I had heeded the warning. But if that were true, why was I still experiencing these unnerving manifestations? Rational voice in my head reminded me that no real harm had come to me. Just fear and the intangible presence of something that consistently hovered in reflections. Perhaps the samurai was still trying to protect me, yet every time I caught sight of him, my chest seized as though I were in mortal danger. I hated the sensation of being trapped in my own skin, my breath hitching, heart pounding on one particular evening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from every reflective surface. The tension had gotten so suffocating that I decided to drape sheets over mirrors and turn every reflective object face down my laptop screen. The glass frames on my walls, even the polished surfaces in my kitchen. Anything that could hold a reflection had to be covered. I spent hours rearranging my apartment until it looked like a stage after a show with dust sheets and dropped curtains everywhere. I tried to convince myself that the emptiness would help me sleep. Instead, the oppressive stillness of the place only amplified the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. In the middle of that night, I had a dream, or something more like a vision. I was standing in my darkened living room with the sheet still covering everything. The samurai stood there too, his armor faintly outlined by moonlight leaking through my window. I felt as though he was communicating gratitude and reassurance without uttering a word. But there was an undercurrent of warning as well, like he was telling me this wasn't over. When I woke up, I found myself clutching the fabric of my bedspread so tightly, my fingers tingled, my pulse, a roaring thunder in my ears at work. The next day, a coworker asked if I was all right. I forced a weak smile and said I hadn't been sleeping well. The coworker suggested I visit a specialist, maybe a therapist. I only nodded absently. I couldn't bring myself to recount all the bizarre phenomena I could already imagine their concerned faces, the inevitable recommendation for medication, and the underlying suspicion that I had broken under corporate stress. My final straw came a week later. I had just returned home from a particularly long day, exhausted and desperate for some semblance of normalcy. I flicked on the lights, dropped my briefcase by the couch, and sank down onto the cushions. That's when I noticed movement in the far corner of the room. My decorative katana, which I usually kept mounted on a wooden stand, was upright on the floor, its blade gleaming in the glow of a nearby lamp. It stood at an angle that defied any logical explanation, as though an invisible hand were holding it in place. I froze, every muscle in my body rigid with adrenaline. My throat tightened and my breathing came in ragged bursts for several seconds. I just stared, incapable of blinking. Sweat beaded on my forehead and slid down the sides of my face. Then, as if relinquishing its grip, the katana toppled with a soft clang onto the wooden floor. I felt a surge of something, defiance, maybe desperation, boiling up inside me. Instead of running, I picked up the katana and carefully placed it back on the stand. My hands trembled and I could feel my heart pounding so fiercely that I had to clench my jaw to steady my breath. I muttered under my breath that if this was the spirit's doing, I needed a sign of intention or an end to the torment. I wasn't sure to whom I was speaking or if it would help. That night I removed the sheets from the mirrors, feeling an odd determination to confront whatever was happening. My pulse was a relentless hammer inside my chest and my palms felt slick with sweat. But I braced myself. I stood in front of my largest mirror, the one in my bedroom, and stared into my reflection. Initially, I saw just my exhausted face and tense shoulders. Then slowly, as though forming from a swirl of fog, I saw his shape materialize behind me. He stood in silent acknowledgement, imposing but not threatening in that moment. It felt like our gazes locked. Even though I couldn't see his eyes through the helm, I thought I sensed relief radiating from him. The longer I stared, the more my terror turned into a grudging acceptance. He was there for a reason, perhaps bound to me by my decision not to go to Tokyo or by some unseen cosmic thread. My muscles gradually unclenched and my breathing steadied. I closed my eyes, half expecting him to vanish. When I opened them, the mirror was empty except for my own tired face. In the following days, the activity lessened. The photographs still show his presence, but I've stopped photographing my home. The sense of being watched remains, but it no longer paralyzes me. I can walk around my apartment at night without feeling like every shadow is trying to swallow me. Occasionally, that wooden box shifts a few inches, or the tapestry rustles in a draftless room each time my heart skips a beat, but I no longer crumble under panic. I've come to believe that the samurai's warning saved me from some unknown fate in Tokyo. I still don't understand why he lingers, but I suspect he's ensuring I honor the path I've chosen sometimes, especially in the hush before dawn. I feel him behind me, and I remember the field in my dreams, the cherry tree, the moonlight. My chest still grows tight from apprehension, yet there's also a certain strange comfort in knowing I'm not entirely alone. I can't say I've made peace with this reality. I live in a constant state of heightened alert, my nerves frayed to the edge. I've tried to explain to myself that it might all be psychological, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The photos, the moving objects, the mirrored reflections that still occasionally reveal his outline. Whatever is happening, it's beyond rational explanation. For now, I remain in S. Paulo. I haven't traveled to Japan, and I doubt I ever will. Some nights I sit in my living room with the lamp turned low, sipping tea from that wooden box, and I feel a presence near me. My hand trembles a bit, but my resolve stays firm. If this spirit or entity is truly thankful, I listened, then perhaps it's granting me a chance to live without regret. The future holds a creeping uncertainty, a lingering tension that hums in my walls. I carry it with me everywhere, like the faint echo of footsteps following just a few paces behind. And although I can function day to day, I know I will never again dismiss that quiet sense of warning when something feels off. I've caught myself glancing into windows and mirrors in public spaces, half hoping and half dreading to see him standing there watching over me from the other side of the glass. Sometimes my heart jolts when I see a flicker, but it's always just my reflection or a trick of the light. Then again, it might be him stepping back into the shadows. Just as I turn my head, the thought sends a ripple of cold through my veins, but it also keeps me vigilant that watchfulness has become my new normal, and a part of me believes that as long as I respect this unseen boundary, I'll remain under his silent protection, even if it means never truly being free of his watchful gaze. Wherever this ends, I'm certain of one thing: the line between reality and the unknown isn't as clear as I once believed. I can't forget the oppressive sense of danger, the dryness in my throat, the chills crawling down my spine. I feel it's still a constant reminder that something watches from beyond the veil. Perhaps it's a warning I heeded just in time, or maybe it's an invitation to remain perpetually alert forever, aware that certain doors once open can never be fully closed,